Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most unbalanced military engagement in human history. 300 men against an army so massive that when they drank from rivers, those rivers ran dry. The Persians brought soldiers from 46 nations, speaking dozens of languages, carrying weapons the Greeks had never seen. They built a bridge across the sea itself, not metaphorically, literally, by lashing hundreds of boats together and marching an entire civilization across open water. When storms destroyed that bridge, their king ordered the ocean whipped 300 times for disobedience, then had the engineers beheaded for incompetence. This is the empire that thought it could walk into Greece and take breakfast. The Greeks gave them a different kind of meal entirely. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We are sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. The year was 480 BC. Xerxes sat on the throne of Persia, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Indus River in modern Pakistan to the shores of Libya in Africa. His domain covered nearly 3 million square miles. 20 different ethnic groups paid him tribute in gold, silver, horses, and men. The royal road connecting his capitals ran 1,600 miles, maintained by the most sophisticated postal system humanity had ever created. Persian messengers could cross the empire in 7 days, changing horses at stations spaced like modern rest stops. When Xerxes wanted something, the known world bent to provide it. He wanted Greece. Not for resources, Persia had those in abundance. Not for strategic position, though that mattered. Xerxes wanted Greece because 10 years earlier, his father Darius had sent an army to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion in Persian territory. That army landed at Marathon, 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians met them on the beach with 10,000 hoplites, heavy infantry, and did something no one thought possible. They charged the Persian centre, absorbed the arrow volleys, and butchered the invaders in close combat. 6,400 Persians died. The Athenians lost 192 men. Darius never forgot that humiliation. Neither did his son. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing an invasion that would erase the memory of Marathon from existence. He assembled an army from every corner of his empire. The immortals came from Persia itself, 10,000 elite infantry, who maintained their number through instant replacement of casualties, hence their name. Cavalry rode from Media and Bactria, expert horsemen who could shoot arrows at full gallop. Infantry marched from Egypt, Ethiopia, and Assyria. The Sacae brought their distinctive pointed caps and battle axes. The Indians contributed troops and war elephants, though the elephants would prove useless in Greek terrain. Ancient historians claimed Xerxes commanded over 1 million soldiers. Modern scholars argue for far less, perhaps 200,000 to 300,000. The real number doesn't matter. What matters is that everyone who saw that army believed it was 1 million strong. When they marched, the dust clouds were visible 50 miles away. When they camped, their cooking fires looked like a second constellation of stars had fallen to earth. The logistics alone staggered imagination. An army that size needed tons of food daily. Supply depots were established years in advance along the route from Persia to Greece. Ships shadowed the army along the coast, carrying grain, weapons, and medical supplies. Xerxes even brought his own portable palace, a massive tent complex that required hundreds of pack animals to transport. The expedition wasn't just military conquest. It was a demonstration of what unlimited resources and absolute power could accomplish. The bridge across the Hellespont, The narrow strait separating Asia from Europe represented the pinnacle of Persian engineering ambition. 2 parallel bridges, each supported by 360 boats, lashed together with flax and papyrus cables. Wooden planks created the roadway. Brush and earth were piled on top so the horses wouldn't see the water beneath and panic. The structure stretched nearly a mile across open water, exposed to storms, currents, and ship traffic. Then nature reminded Xerxes that oceans don't care about empires. A massive storm struck before the army could cross. The cables snapped, the boats scattered, the bridges disintegrated. Xerxes' response revealed the mentality driving this invasion. He ordered 300 lashes applied to the Hellespont itself, soldiers literally whipping the water with chains. The engineers who designed the bridges were beheaded. New engineers built new bridges using the same design but stronger cables. The army crossed successfully, though it took 7 days and 7 nights of continuous marching for everyone to reach the European side. Greece should have united instantly against this threat. Instead, the city-states continued their traditional backstabbing. Athens and Sparta were the major powers, but they despised each other. Athens was a radical democracy where citizens voted on everything, creating policy through debate and consensus. Sparta was a military oligarchy, where 2 hereditary kings ruled over a society designed entirely around warfare. Dozens of smaller city-states played both sides, seeking advantage rather than survival. The Persians understood these divisions perfectly. Xerxes sent ambassadors throughout Greece offering terms: acknowledge Persian supremacy, provide earth and water as tokens of submission, and you'll be left alone. Many cities accepted. They had no choice. Some had only a few thousand people total. What chance did they have against an army that blotted out the horizon? Athens refused. Sparta refused. But they didn't coordinate their refusal or plan a joint defense. Each city prepared its own response based on its own interests. The Greek peninsula, with its mountains and islands, made unified command nearly impossible anyway. No roads connected the major cities. Communication travelled at the speed of a runner or a ship, measured in days and weeks. Spartan scouts tracked the Persian advance through Thrace and Macedonia, both of which submitted without fighting. The reports they brought back to Sparta weren't military intelligence, they were descriptions of the apocalypse. The Persian army filled entire valleys. Their supply trains stretched for miles. Local populations fled before them, not because the Persians were particularly brutal, but because no region could feed that many foreign soldiers without starving itself. King Leonidas received these reports in Sparta's austere capital, a city famous for having no walls. Spartans didn't need walls, they had warriors. But even Leonidas understood that warriors alone couldn't stop what was coming. The numbers were too vast. The Persian cavalry could simply ride around any Greek formation and attack from behind. Their archers could fire volleys that darkened the sky, as the saying went. Traditional battle tactics, the kind Greeks had perfected over centuries, wouldn't work against an enemy this massive. Then the oracle at Delphi delivered her prophecy. The priestess of Apollo, speaking in the god's voice, gave Sparta a choice. Either the city itself would fall and be completely destroyed, or one of Sparta's kings must die in battle. The prophecy was specific enough to be terrifying and vague enough to be useless for planning. How could a king's death save the entire city? What battle? Against whom? Under what circumstances? Leonidas didn't know the answers, but he understood the core truth. Someone had to sacrifice everything, and it had to be spectacular enough that the other Greek cities would finally wake up and fight together. A slow retreat wouldn't inspire anyone. A defensive stand that eventually broke wouldn't create martyrs. What Greece needed was a last stand so dramatic so suicidally brave that every Greek from Athens to Syracuse would feel ashamed for not fighting. The Persian army continued south, conquering or accepting the submission of everything in its path. Northern Greece collapsed without serious resistance. Thessaly, a region famous for its cavalry, switched sides and joined Xerxes. The Persians now had Greek guides who knew the terrain, and Greek soldiers who understood Greek tactics. The expedition was working exactly as planned. Xerxes sent messengers ahead demanding earth and water from the remaining cities. The Athenians threw the Persian ambassadors into a pit used for executing criminals. The Spartans threw theirs down a well, suggesting they could find earth and water at the bottom. These insults meant war would be total. The Persians wouldn't just conquer, they would erase Athens and Sparta from existence as object lessons. The Greek city-states finally convened a council on the Isthmus of Corinth. Representatives argued for days about strategy. Some wanted to defend northern Greece, maintaining as much territory as possible. Others insisted on falling back to the isthmus itself, building a wall across the narrow neck of land connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland. Athens wanted a naval strategy, betting everything on their fleet. Sparta wanted ground combat where their hoplites could dominate. They compromised with a plan that satisfied nobody. Hold the Persians at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass in central Greece, while the navy fought at nearby Artemisium. If both positions held, the Persian advance would stall. If either broke, the strategy collapsed. The naval battle would take place simultaneously. Weather and timing mattered as much as tactics. Thermopylae meant hot gates, named for the thermal springs in the area. The pass ran between steep mountains and the sea, narrowing in places to a space so tight that two wagons couldn't pass side by side. Ancient Phocians had built a defensive wall there centuries earlier, though it had fallen into disrepair. The position had one critical weakness. A mountain path called Anopeia ran above the pass, allowing anyone who knew about it to bypass the gates entirely. Local shepherds used it regularly. Leonidas volunteered to lead the force holding Thermopylae. As one of Sparta's two kings, he had the authority and the reputation to inspire other cities to send troops. But Sparta faced a religious problem. The Carneia festival, sacred to Apollo, was underway. During Carneia, Spartan law forbade military campaigns. The entire army couldn't march. Only a personal bodyguard could accompany the king. Leonidas chose 300 men. All were Spartiates, full citizens of Sparta. All were over 30 years old. Most importantly, all had living sons. This last requirement wasn't about military effectiveness. It was about preserving Sparta's bloodlines. If these 300 died, their families would continue. The city would survive even if these men didn't. The selection process revealed something essential about Spartan psychology. Leonidas didn't choose the youngest or strongest warriors. He chose fathers, men with responsibilities, men whose deaths would hurt. Because those were the men who would fight hardest and die most memorably. The mission wasn't to win. It was to lose so magnificently that Greece would finally unite. Word spread quickly that Leonidas was marching north with only 300 Spartans. Other cities sent contingents to join him. Thespiae, a small city often overshadowed by its neighbours, sent 700 men, proportionally far more than Sparta contributed. Thebes sent 400, though their loyalty was questionable. Various smaller cities added troops until the force numbered around 7,000. But everyone understood the 300 Spartans were the core. They marched out of Sparta knowing they wouldn't return. Their wives and mothers said goodbye with traditional Spartan bluntness, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning win or die trying. Dropping your shield to run faster was the ultimate disgrace. The 300 moved north at the forced march pace Spartan training made sustainable, 20 miles per day through mountainous terrain. They carried their own equipment, 70 pounds of bronze armour, weapons, supplies. No servants accompanied them beyond the helots who managed baggage. This was a warrior elite moving to war, not a royal procession. As they marched, messengers brought updates. The Persian army had crossed into Greece. The fleet sailed parallel to the army along the coast. Macedon had submitted. Thessaly had submitted. Northern Greece was essentially gone. The Persians would reach Thermopylae in perhaps 10 days. Leonidas studied maps and questioned locals about the terrain. The pass was everything the reports promised: narrow, defensible, deadly. The mountain path bothered him. A small force could guard it, but only if they knew the Persians had learned about it. The Phocians, natives of the region, promised to station troops on the path. Leonidas had to trust them. He had no other choice. The 300 reached Thermopylae and found the old Phocian wall still standing, though damaged by centuries of weather and neglect. They began repairs immediately, stacking stones and mortar, turning the wall back into a proper fortification. Other Greek contingents arrived and took positions. The Thespians camped closest to the Spartans, a statement of solidarity. The Thebans stayed separate, watched carefully. Persian scouts appeared on the hills overlooking the pass. They observed the Greek preparations and rode back to report. One scout witnessed something that would be repeated in every account of the battle. Spartans outside the wall, completely relaxed, some exercising naked, others combing their long hair. They acted like men preparing for an athletic competition, not a battle against impossible odds. When Xerxes heard this report, he laughed. These fools were primping like women before their deaths. They had no idea what was coming. His army could march straight over them through sheer weight of numbers. The narrow pass meant nothing. Persians would simply climb over Greek corpses until the pass filled level with bodies. He had no idea what Spartan warriors were actually like. No idea what 300 men who had trained for nothing but killing since age 7 could accomplish. No idea that the narrow pass was about to become the worst tactical nightmare his empire had ever encountered. The oracle's prophecy hung over everything. Sparta will fall, or a king must die. Leonidas prepared the ground, positioned his troops, and waited for the Persian storm to break. Understanding why 300 Spartans could hold against hundreds of thousands requires understanding what Sparta actually was. Not the Hollywood version with chiseled heroes and inspiring speeches. The real Sparta, a society so twisted by fear and violence that it created the most effective killers the ancient world had ever seen, then trapped them in a system that guaranteed their eventual extinction. Sparta sat in the Laconian Valley in southern Greece, surrounded by mountains that made invasion difficult but not impossible. The city controlled roughly 3,400 square miles of territory. 9,000 Spartiate families, full citizens with political rights, ruled over approximately 250,000 helots. These weren't slaves in the traditional sense. They were the original Greek inhabitants of the region, conquered centuries earlier, reduced to permanent servitude but allowed to live on the land and maintain families. The math was horrifying. Roughly 28 helots for every Spartan warrior. A revolution could erupt any day. One successful uprising would mean the complete annihilation of Spartan society within hours. Every Spartan lived with this knowledge from birth to death. Their entire civilization was constructed around one paranoid question: how do we keep a massive enslaved population from cutting our throats while we sleep? The answer was terror. Systematic, calculated, unrelenting terror. The agog began at age 7. Spartan boys were torn from their mothers and sorted into barracks units that became their new families. The stated purpose was military training. The real purpose was breaking human empathy and rebuilding it around unit cohesion. Boys slept on beds they made themselves from river reeds, gathered without knives. They received one cloak per year regardless of season. Winter in Laconia could drop below freezing. Food was deliberately insufficient. Instructors encouraged theft from helot farms, then brutally punished any boy caught stealing. The lesson wasn't about morality, it was about competence. Steal successfully or starve, but don't disgrace yourself by getting caught. Boys who couldn't adapt died from malnutrition, exposure or training accidents. Nobody mourned them. Weakness was genetic and Sparta needed strong genes. Physical training consumed every day. Wrestling, boxing, running, weapons drill. Boys fought each other with full intensity, supervised by older students who would beat anyone showing mercy or excessive cruelty. The balance mattered. Spartans needed aggression under perfect control, not mindless berserkers. At age 12, the training intensified. Food rations decreased further. Boys were expected to steal more cleverly, hunt small animals, supplement their diet however possible. The cryptire began at age 18, the secret police, though that term doesn't capture the horror. Selected young men received a knife and a mission. Go into helot territory and kill. No restrictions on targets, no rules of engagement. The point was creating terror among the helot population, while giving young Spartans practice in assassination and night operations. Cryptire members targeted strong helots, intelligent helots, anyone who might organize resistance. They struck from darkness, left bodies as warnings, disappeared before dawn. This wasn't punishment for crimes or even military necessity. It was state-sponsored murder as a coming-of-age ritual. Every year, Sparta's ephors, 5 elected magistrates, formally declared war on the helot population. This legal fiction meant killing helots wasn't murder under Spartan law. It was warfare. The cryptire could hunt human beings for sport and call it patriotic duty. The young men practicing these skills would become the 300 marching to Thermopylae. They had murdered before they turned 20. Most had killed multiple times before earning full citizenship at 30. The psychological impact created something unique in Greek warfare. Soldiers completely comfortable with close-quarters killing, untroubled by blood or screaming, capable of executing wounded enemies without hesitation. But the system that made them deadly also made them scarce. Spartan citizens didn't work. That was helot labour. They didn't farm, build, craft, or trade. They trained for war and managed the helot population. This meant the citizen body couldn't grow beyond what the helots could support. Every generation, plague or war casualties reduced Spartiate numbers. Intermarriage outside the citizen class was forbidden. The genetic pool contracted steadily. By 480 BC, Sparta could field perhaps 8,000 Spartiates of military age. Not 8,000 soldiers available for deployment, 8,000 total adult male citizens. Most had to stay in Laconia constantly watching for helot rebellion. The 300 Leonidas selected represented nearly 4% of Sparta's entire fighting force. Losing them would hurt, though not cripple the state militarily. The equipment each Spartan carried represented decades of metalworking skill and substantial wealth. The bronze breastplate was custom-fitted, hammered from a single piece of metal shaped to deflect sword blows away from vital organs. A skilled smith needed weeks to produce one. The bronze greaves protecting shins were similarly personalized. The Corinthian helmet, arguably the most recognizable piece of ancient armor, covered the entire head except for eye slits and a T-shaped opening for nose and mouth. It weighed around 5 pounds. Wearing it was like fighting inside a metal box that amplified your own breathing into a roar while muffling external sounds. The hoplon shield defined Greek warfare. Roughly 3 feet in diameter, made from wood covered in bronze, It weighed 70 to 80 pounds depending on construction. A leather strap in the centre allowed the left forearm to support most of the weight, while a grip near the rim let the hand control positioning. The shield's size meant it protected not just the carrier but the man to his left. This created the phalanx, a formation where each warrior's survival depended on his neighbour holding position. Breaking formation meant exposing your comrade's unshielded right side to enemy weapons. This social pressure kept lines intact even under horrific casualties. Running away wasn't just cowardice, it was murdering your friends by leaving them unprotected. Spartans drilled phalanx movements until they could execute complex maneuvers by sound signals alone, advancing, contracting, or wheeling without verbal orders. The primary weapon was the dory spear, 8 to 10 feet long, ash wood shaft tipped with iron, a bronze butt spike on the opposite end. The spear was designed for the phalanx formation, projecting forward while the shield wall held firm. When spears broke, and they broke constantly in the crush of combat, Spartans drew the xiphos. This short sword, maybe 2 feet long, was a stabbing weapon optimized for the incredibly close quarters of phalanx fighting. The blade was leaf-shaped, widening toward the middle, tapering to a sharp point. It was designed to punch through the gaps in armor, under the armpit, through the groin, into the throat. Spartans trained with the xiphos through exercises that other Greeks considered excessive. They practiced on animal carcasses, learning exactly where to strike for quick kills. They wrestled while holding wooden training swords, getting comfortable with blade work at grappling distance. The xiphos wasn't a weapon you swung dramatically. It was a tool for murder at arm's length, where you could smell your enemy's last meal and feel his blood spray across your face. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. Spartan society was segregated in ways that made ancient Athens look progressive. Spartan women controlled property, managed estates, and exercised publicly. Shocking behaviour by Greek standards. But this wasn't about equality. It was about breeding. Strong mothers produced strong sons. Women who couldn't survive childbirth were genetically weak, so their elimination actually benefited the state. Spartan women were expected to be as ruthless about bloodline quality as the men. Marriage happened late, men around 30, women around 20. By that age, Spartans had completed their basic training and proven their worth. The wedding ceremony itself was bizarre. The groom kidnapped the bride, who had her head shaved and was dressed in men's clothing. The couple consummated the marriage, then the man returned to his barracks. He would continue living with his military unit, visiting his wife only at night, for years. Children belonged to the state more than to parents. Newborn infants were inspected by elders. Those deemed too weak or deformed were left to die of exposure in the nearby hills. This wasn't considered murder. It was quality control. Sparta couldn't waste resources on citizens who wouldn't become effective warriors or mothers. The practice was so routine that Greek historians barely mentioned it, noting it only when describing what made Sparta different from other cities. The 300 marching to Thermopylae had survived this selection process twice, once as infants, once through the ergoge. They represented the absolute peak of Spartan society, men who had proven their physical capability, demonstrated their ruthlessness, produced heirs to continue their bloodlines, and now carried their city's reputation into battle. Leonidas chose them specifically because they were expendable in the coldest possible sense. Their genetic contribution was complete. Their deaths would hurt their families but not cripple Sparta's future. This calculation reveals the fundamental sickness in Spartan culture. They'd created the perfect military machine by sacrificing everything that makes civilization worthwhile. No art beyond war songs, no philosophy beyond military tactics, no architecture beyond barracks and armories. Athens would produce Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Sparta produced nothing but corpses, enemy corpses, helot corpses, and eventually their own. But in the short term, that focus made them unstoppable. When 300 Spartans stood together in phalanx formation, they became a single organism with 300 brains but one purpose. They had trained together for years. Many had known each other since age 7. They understood each other's movements instinctively, could anticipate actions without communication, trusted absolutely that the man beside them would hold his position even if it meant death. This trust extended to their king. Leonidas was around 50 years old in 480 BC, ancient by warrior standards. He had survived decades of combat, political maneuvering, and the constant danger of Spartan life. He was one of 2 hereditary kings, though the other king, Leonidas, remained in Sparta. The dual monarchy was another paranoid Spartan innovation. 2 kings watching each other, preventing either from accumulating too much power. Leonidas had chosen the 300 personally, examining service records, consulting with unit commanders, selecting based on combat experience and family status. Some of the men were his relatives by blood or marriage. Sparta's elite intermarried constantly, creating a web of kinship that reinforced social bonds. Others were from families that had feuded with Leonidas's lineage for generations, but none of that mattered once they formed phalanx. Personal disputes vanished behind the shield wall. The march to Thermopylae took them through territory that highlighted everything wrong with Greek political organization. They passed cities that had already submitted to Persia, whose citizens watched the Spartans pass with expressions ranging from pity to contempt. Why fight when submission would preserve their lives and property? The Spartans ignored them. Arguments about strategy were pointless. Either you stood against tyranny or you didn't. Sparta had made its choice. When they reached Thermopylae and began repairing the Phocian wall, other Greek contingents arrived and saw the Spartans working like common labourers, hauling stones, mixing mortar, building fortifications with their own hands. This was unusual. Elite warriors typically supervised while lower classes did manual labour. But Spartan training included every skill needed for campaign survival. They could build, cook, tend wounds, repair equipment. Self-sufficiency was another weapon. The Persian scouts watching from the hills saw the Spartans exercising and grooming with elaborate care, not understanding they were witnessing pre-battle ritual. Spartans grew their hair long as a mark of citizenship. Helots were forbidden long hair, making the distinction visible at a distance. Before battle, warriors combed and oiled their hair ceremonially, an ancient custom that transformed personal grooming into religious preparation. They were making themselves beautiful for death, preparing their bodies as offerings to the gods who would receive their spirits. The exercises weren't nervous energy, they were tactical preparation. Spartans drilled their phalanx movements constantly, even after decades of training. Muscle memory degraded quickly. Every day without practice made the formation slightly less effective. So they drilled, rehearsing advances and retreats, testing the ground, learning how terrain would affect their movements during actual combat. When Persian scouts reported this behavior to Xerxes, he interpreted it as ignorance or cowardice masquerading as bravado. He had no frame of reference for understanding a military culture this alien. Persian warriors were brave, skilled, and numerous, but they fought as individuals or small units, seeking personal glory and advancement through displays of courage. The idea of 300 men functioning as a single organism, each willing to die to protect the formation, existed outside Persian military philosophy. Xerxes commanded soldiers who served for pay, promotion, or because their conquered territories required military service. Leonidas commanded men who had literally been raised from infancy for this exact moment, standing in a narrow pass against impossible odds, holding a line that would buy time for the cities behind them. The cultural gap between these two forces was wider than the physical distance they had travelled. The Spartans finished repairing the wall and settled in to wait. They knew the Persians were coming. Scouts reported the enemy army's position daily, tracking its advance south through Greece. The waiting was tactical. Every day the Persians spent marching was a day Athens and other cities spent preparing defences, building ships, fortifying positions. The longer Thermopylae held, the better chance Greece had of mounting effective resistance. Leonidas walked the pass repeatedly, studying sight lines and choke points, calculating exactly where the killing would be most efficient. The ground was everything. Terrain would multiply their force, turn their few into many, make Persian numbers irrelevant. The pass narrowed to perhaps 50 feet at its tightest point. Only so many men could fight shoulder to shoulder in that space. Behind them, thousands more Persians would wait uselessly, unable to engage because their own troops blocked access. The mountain path worried him constantly. The Phocians had stationed troops up there, perhaps 1,000 men. But if the Persians learned about it and sent a flanking force, the entire position became untenable. Leonidas couldn't spare Spartans to guard the path. He needed everyone for the wall. He had to trust allies whose commitment was questionable and whose military skill was definitely inferior. Everything was ready. The wall was repaired. Positions were assigned. The phalanx had drilled until every movement was automatic. Weapons were sharpened, armour checked for weak points, prayers offered to appropriate gods. The 300 Spartans stood at the narrow point of Thermopylae and waited for the Persian Empire to arrive and try to push through them. They didn't have to wait long. The Persian vanguard appeared on the northern hills 4 days before the main army arrived. Cavalry scouts in flowing trousers and pointed caps surveyed the Greek position from a distance that kept them outside javelin range. They counted the defenders, noted the repaired wall, studied the terrain with professional attention. One scout rode closer than the others, approaching within shouting distance, observing the Spartans with undisguised curiosity. What he saw must have seemed absurd. A handful of warriors lounging outside their fortification like farmers taking a midday rest. Some wrestled naked in the sun, others sat combing their hair with elaborate care, running ivory combs through waist-length locks darkened with oil. None appeared concerned about the massive army approaching from the north. The scout watched for perhaps an hour, then wheeled his horse and galloped back to report this bizarre scene to his commanders. The report travelled up the Persian chain of command until it reached Xerxes himself. The great king sitting in his travelling throne laughed at the description. 300 men primping like maidens before a festival, apparently unaware they were about to be crushed beneath the largest army ever assembled. The intelligence confirmed what he already believed. These Greeks were delusional, their bravery indistinguishable from stupidity. Xerxes waited 4 days after his vanguard arrived. This wasn't mercy or hesitation. The Persian army was so vast that it took 4 full days for all units to reach the staging area north of Thermopylae. Cavalry, infantry, baggage trains, siege equipment, supply wagons. They stretched back along the coastal road for miles. As each unit arrived, commanders assigned camping zones, established perimeters, organised supply distribution. The logistics were staggering even by Persian standards. The Greeks used those 4 days differently. Leonidas positioned his forces with tactical precision, assigning each contingent to specific sectors based on their capabilities and his level of trust. The Spartans held the centre, directly behind the narrowest point of the pass. The Thespians took position on their right flank, an honour reflecting their commitment to the stand. The Thebans were placed on the left, watched carefully by nearby units. Other allied contingents spread along the defensive line, filling gaps, providing reserves. The wall itself was perhaps 4 feet high, enough to disrupt a charge but not enough to prevent determined attackers from climbing over. Its real value was psychological and tactical. It marked the defensive line clearly, gave defenders something solid at their backs, and forced attackers to slow their momentum as they scrambled over stone. The Greeks positioned supplies behind the wall: water, food, spare weapons, medical materials. This wasn't a position they expected to hold indefinitely. It was ground they planned to make incredibly expensive to take. The thermal springs that gave Thermopylae its name bubbled up near the eastern end of the pass, steaming even in summer heat. The smell of sulphur hung in the air constantly, mixing with the salt tang from the nearby sea. The beach was narrow, just a strip of sand and rocks between the water and the steep hillside. High tide reduced the passable width further, making the choke point even tighter. On the 4th day, a Persian herald rode to within shouting distance of the Greek lines. His message was simple and had been delivered to cities throughout Greece with consistent results. Surrender your weapons and acknowledge Persian authority. In exchange, you'll be spared and allowed to return home. Refuse, and you'll be annihilated. The herald delivered this message in Greek. The Persians had translators for every language in their empire. Leonidas's response became instantly famous, though it was probably more mundane than legend suggests. The 3-word reply, Molon Labe, come and take them, captured perfectly the Spartan combination of contempt and challenge. The herald rode back to report that negotiation had failed. Xerxes now understood he would have to take the pass by force. This pleased him. Crushing these arrogant Greeks would send a clearer message than accepting their submission. The Persian army spent the evening before battle in preparation rituals from dozens of different cultures. Some units sacrificed animals and read omens in the entrails. Others prayed to gods the Greeks had never heard of, using names that sounded harsh and foreign. The immortals sharpened their weapons in precise measured strokes, maintaining equipment that was already battle-ready. The cavalry checked their horses' hooves and tack, knowing the rocky terrain would be treacherous. Xerxes ordered an attack at dawn. He selected Median and Scythian troops for the first assault, good soldiers but not his best. This was standard Persian tactical doctrine: spend expendable troops first to exhaust defenders and identify weaknesses, then commit elite forces against a weakened enemy. The Medians numbered around 10,000, organised in units of 1,000 under experienced commanders. They carried wicker shields covered in leather, spears shorter than Greek dory, and short swords for close combat. The Greeks watched the Persians form up in the pre-dawn darkness. Torches lit the enemy staging area, revealing mass formations that seemed to extend into infinity. The sound of 10,000 men preparing for battle, metal scraping metal, leather creaking, officers shouting orders, carried clearly across the morning stillness. Then the torches began moving forward as the Median advance began. The Persians expected a standard engagement, exchange of missile fire, then a general melee where superior numbers would overwhelm the defenders. They were equipped and trained for this type of warfare. Their lighter armour allowed faster movement. Their shorter spears were better for individual combat. The wicker shields were easier to carry for long distances, though less protective than Greek bronze. What happened instead violated every assumption of Persian military doctrine. The Greeks didn't meet them halfway. The phalanx held position behind the wall, shields locked, spears lowered, absolutely motionless except for the slight swaying caused by breathing. The Spartans in the centre stood like bronze statues, their Corinthian helmets creating a wall of metal faces with dark eye holes that revealed nothing human. The Medians hit the wall at a run, trying to use momentum to break through or climb over. The Greek line absorbed the impact without giving an inch. The first Persians to reach the phalanx died on spear points before they could strike a blow. The dory's length meant Greeks could stab attackers while remaining protected behind their shields. Persian spears were too short to reach past the Greek shields to threaten the men holding them. The killing became systematic. Persians climbing the wall exposed themselves to spear thrusts from multiple angles. Those trying to push through gaps in the stone found themselves fighting uphill against locked shields. The ones who made it over the wall encountered the second rank of the phalanx, fresh spears stabbing from behind the first line. Bodies began piling against the wall, creating a rampart of corpses that made footing treacherous. The Medians fought bravely. Courage was never their limitation. They threw themselves at the Greek line repeatedly, dying by dozens with each wave. But their equipment and training were wrong for this type of combat. Wicker shields splintered under Greek spear thrusts. Light armour provided minimal protection against bronze-tipped dory driven by men whose entire lives had been spent building the strength to use these weapons effectively. After perhaps 2 hours of continuous assault, the Median commanders pulled their troops back. They had lost hundreds, maybe thousands, with essentially zero Greek casualties. The narrow pass prevented them from using their numbers effectively. They couldn't flank the Greek position because mountains blocked one side and sea blocked the other. They couldn't fire arrows over their own troops effectively because the angle was wrong, and hitting their own men was as likely as hitting Greeks. Xerxes watched from his throne, positioned on a hill, with a clear view of the pass. He stood 3 times during the Median assault, according to later Greek accounts, standing in shock as his troops were slaughtered without apparent effect on the defenders. This wasn't how battles worked. Superior numbers should overwhelm inferior numbers through simple mathematics. 10,000 against 7,000 should result in Persian victory. Instead, the Persians couldn't even reach the Greek line in effective numbers. The problem was the choke point. At the narrowest section, perhaps 40 men could fight shoulder to shoulder. This meant the Greek phalanx could maintain a continuous wall of shields and spears across the entire width of the pass. The Persians, unable to deploy more than 40 fighters simultaneously at the contact point, gained no advantage from their superior numbers. Thousands of Persian warriors stood uselessly behind the front ranks, waiting for space to open so they could engage. Xerxes sent in the Scythians next, troops from the Zagros Mountains east of Mesopotamia, renowned for their ferocity and endurance. They attacked with different tactics, trying to find weaknesses in the Greek formation through probing advances rather than mass charges. The result was identical. The phalanx held absolutely firm, rotating fresh men to the front ranks, while exhausted fighters fell back to rest. This rotation system meant the Greeks fighting at any given moment were always fresh, while Persian troops stayed engaged until killed or too exhausted to continue. The Scythian assault lasted into the afternoon. Bodies clogged the pass, forcing Persian troops to literally climb over their own dead to reach the Greek line. The smell became overwhelming. Blood, excrement, sulphur from the hot springs, the copper tang of fresh wounds. Flies appeared in clouds, attracted by the carnage. The temperature climbed into the high 80s, turning bronze armour into ovens that cooked the men wearing them. The Greeks suffered too, though their casualties remained minimal. Heat exhaustion affected everyone equally. Men in the rear ranks poured water over those in front, trying to cool them enough to keep fighting. The Spartans drank sparingly and rotated frequently, understanding that staying fresh was more important than holding position at all costs. Wounded Greeks were pulled behind the lines where basic medical treatment, bandaging, cauterizing, kept them alive long enough to potentially recover. By late afternoon of the first day, Xerxes faced an impossible situation. He had committed perhaps 20,000 troops to taking the pass. Somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 of them were dead or too wounded to fight. The Greeks had lost perhaps 20 men. The mathematical reality was staggering. Persian forces were dying at a ratio approaching 200 to 1. At this rate, Xerxes could lose his entire army before breaking through. He called his commanders together for evening council. The consensus was that the Greek position was stronger than intelligence had suggested, and that different tactics were needed. Some argued for bypassing the pass entirely, loading troops onto ships and landing behind the Greek lines. Others suggested waiting for the Greeks to run out of supplies and be forced to retreat. Naval landings would take days to organize, though, and the Persian fleet was simultaneously engaged at Artemisium. Waiting was strategically problematic. Every day spent at Thermopylae was a day Greece used to prepare defences deeper into the country. Night fell with the pass still firmly in Greek hands. The Spartans built small fires and ate a cold meal of barley cake, cheese and dried fish. They cleaned blood from their weapons and armour, checked equipment for damage, tended minor wounds. The mood was relaxed, almost cheerful. They had held for a day. One day was already more than most Greek cities had managed against the Persians. The Persians spent the night counting casualties and reorganizing units. Burial parties worked through the darkness, recovering bodies where possible and clearing the worst accumulations from the approach to the pass. The Greeks refused to allow Persian recovery teams near the wall, so the immediate killing ground remained carpeted with corpses. This was tactical. The bodies created obstacles that slowed future attacks. Dawn of the second day revealed the same situation. Greeks behind their wall, Persians mustering for another assault. Xerxes committed the Immortals, his absolute best infantry, 10,000 strong, equipped with superior weapons and armour by Persian standards. These were professional soldiers, many of whom had trained together for years. They were called Immortals because the unit always maintained exactly 10,000 men through immediate replacement of casualties. No matter how many died, the unit's strength never appeared to change. The Immortals advance with disciplined precision, maintaining formation, advancing in coordinated waves designed to probe for weaknesses without sacrificing troops unnecessarily. They fought intelligently, using their numbers to pressure multiple points along the Greek line simultaneously. For the first time, the phalanx showed strain. The Immortals were skilled enough to target individual defenders, trying to isolate and kill specific warriors to create gaps in the shield wall. But the fundamental tactical problem remained unchanged. The pass was too narrow. Superior training and equipment couldn't overcome the simple geometry of the chokepoint. The Immortals died more slowly than the Medians had, extracting a slightly higher casualty rate from the defenders, but they died nonetheless. By midday, Xerxes pulled them back, having lost hundreds of his best troops without gaining a single foot of ground. The Persian king was now facing something beyond military defeat. His reputation was at stake. The entire empire was watching to see if he could succeed where his father had failed. Every day spent stalled at Thermopylae was a day for doubters to question whether Persian power was really unlimited. The Greeks had to be crushed, not just defeated. They had to be annihilated so thoroughly that no one would dare resist again. Then, on the evening of the second day, a Greek man approached the Persian camp under flag of truce. His name was Ephialtes, a local from the Tracius region near Thermopylae. He had information to sell, and the price was substantial. He knew a path through the mountains, a shepherd's trail called the Anopeia that wound above the pass and emerged behind the Greek position. A force using this path could bypass Thermopylae entirely, descending on the defenders from behind while the main army attacked from the front. Xerxes questioned Ephialtes extensively about the path, its width, condition, defensibility. The traitor provided detailed answers. The path was narrow but passable for infantry in single file. It would take most of a night to traverse. The Greeks supposedly had troops stationed on the path, but Ephialtes suggested they were few in number and could be overwhelmed quickly. The information was worth more than gold. Xerxes ordered an immediate night march using the Immortals again. They had rested and reorganized since the day's failed assault. Hydarnes, the Immortals' commander, personally led the expedition with Ephialtes guiding. They moved out after dark, perhaps 10,000 men following a traitor's directions through mountain terrain they couldn't see clearly. Meanwhile, at the pass, Leonidas slept for perhaps 4 hours while his men maintained watch. The second day had been harder than the first. The Greeks had taken real casualties now, maybe 50 dead, and twice that wounded seriously enough to be combat ineffective. The Persians were learning, adapting their tactics, finding weaknesses. The phalanx was holding, but the strain was visible. The Spartans knew this couldn't last indefinitely. Eventually exhaustion would crack their discipline, or a clever Persian tactic would break their line. The goal had never been to hold forever, just long enough to matter. 2 days was already significant. 3 days would be legendary. Every additional hour bought time for Athens to evacuate, for the Greek navy to position itself, for the other cities to prepare. The third day would determine whether Thermopylae became a footnote or an immortal story. As the Spartans settled in for another night of brief rest before dawn combat, the Immortals were climbing through mountain darkness toward the Anopeia path. The trap was closing, though the Greeks didn't yet know it. The third day began with a Persian feint that almost worked. Just after dawn, a small force of perhaps 500 Persians rushed the wall while the main body held back. The Greeks braced for another standard assault, locking shields and setting spears. Instead, the Persians stopped just outside spear range and began hurling javelins in high arcs, trying to drop them behind the shield wall where they might hit exposed heads or legs. The tactic was sound, but the execution failed. Greek shields were large enough to provide overhead protection when angled properly, and the Spartans had drilled defensive positions for every conceivable attack angle. The javelins clattered harmlessly against bronze or stuck in wooden shield backs. A few Greeks took minor wounds, a gash across the thigh, a javelin through a foot, but nothing that broke the line. Then the real attack came. Thousands of Persian infantry surged forward while the javelin throwers retreated. This was coordinated assault doctrine. Suppress defenders with missiles, then close while they're disrupted. The Greeks absorbed the charge exactly as they had the previous 2 days. Spears thrust, Persians died, bodies accumulated. The mathematics of the chokepoint remained brutally simple, but something was different this third day. The Persians fought with desperate intensity, throwing themselves at the Greek line with minimal regard for casualties. They weren't trying to break through anymore, they were trying to pin the defenders in place. The Greek commanders noticed this change but couldn't determine its significance. Why would Xerxes waste troops on a holding action when his previous attempts to break through had failed? The Immortals' night march through the mountains had been exhausting but successful. The Anopeia path was exactly where Ephialtes promised, winding through oak forest and rocky outcrops invisible in the darkness. Hydarnes kept his troops moving steadily, knowing that speed mattered more than stealth at this point. The Greeks supposedly guarding the path would hear 10,000 men approaching regardless of how quiet they tried to be. Dawn found the Immortals perhaps 2/3 of the way along the path. The oak trees that dominated this elevation still dripped with dew, making the ground treacherous. Loose rocks shifted underfoot. Several soldiers slipped and fell, though the injuries were minor. The path was wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast in most places, narrowing to single file in others. Hydarnes pushed the pace, understanding that timing was critical for the plan to work. The Phocian force stationed to guard the Anopeia path numbered about 1,000 men. positioned at a widening in the trail where they could form a proper defensive line. Their commander had placed them there specifically because it was defensible, a logical choice that proved catastrophically wrong. The Phocians were good troops by average Greek standards, experienced with local terrain, adequately armed and motivated to defend their territory. The sound of the approaching immortals reached them perhaps 15 minutes before visual contact. The rustling of thousands of feet through fallen oak leaves, the clink of equipment, the heavy breathing of men who had climbed all night. The Phocian commander formed his troops across the path, shields locked, preparing to hold this position against whatever was coming. When the first immortals came into view, the Phocians realized immediately they were catastrophically outnumbered. 1,000 defenders against what appeared to be an endless column of enemy infantry. The immortals deployed rapidly from marching column into attack formation, their discipline evident even after a night march. They had done this maneuver countless times, could execute it blind if necessary. The Phocian commander made a split-second decision that saved his men's lives but doomed the defence of Thermopylae. Rather than die holding an impossible position, he ordered his troops to retreat uphill, away from the path, into rougher terrain where the Persians couldn't easily follow. The Phocians scattered into the oak forest, abandoning their post without a fight. Hydarnes had expected to fight through this obstacle. Finding it evaporated before him was suspicious. Were the Phocians regrouping for an ambush? Was this a trap? He sent scouts ahead cautiously, while the main force advanced along the now clear path. The scouts found nothing. The Phocians had genuinely fled, taking position on higher ground but making no attempt to block the Persian advance. The decision not to pursue was tactical. Hydarnes' mission was bypassing Thermopylae, not hunting Phocian stragglers through mountain forest. Every minute spent chasing Greeks up hillsides was a minute delayed in reaching the position behind Leonidas. The immortals continued along the Anopia path at double time, now unopposed. A Phocian runner reached the pass around mid-morning, bringing news that shattered the Greek defensive plan. The mountain path had fallen. The Persians were behind them. Encirclement was imminent. Leonidas received this report while actively engaged. Spartans in the front rank, shields locked, spears bloody, fighting a Persian assault that had been raging for hours. The tactical situation became clear instantly. If the immortals descended from the mountains while the main Persian force attacked from the front, the Greeks would be trapped between two armies and annihilated. The position that had been defensible for 2 days was now a death trap. Every Greek commander at Thermopylae understood this. The council of war was brief because the options were obvious: retreat immediately or die here. Leonidas ordered most of the Greek forces to withdraw. The allied contingents from various cities, perhaps 5,000 men total, were released from their positions and told to march south immediately, taking routes that would avoid the descending immortals. These troops had families, cities that needed defending, lives worth preserving. Their withdrawal wasn't cowardice, it was strategic necessity. The Thespians refused to leave. All 700 of them, under their commander Demophilus, insisted on remaining with the Spartans. This wasn't blind loyalty or theatrical bravery. Thespia sat north of Athens, directly in the Persian path. If Thermopylae fell quickly, Thespia would be destroyed within days. Every hour the pass remained contested was another hour for their families to evacuate. The Thespians understood this math and chose death to buy time for their children. The Theban contingent of 400 men stayed as well, though their motivation was different. Thebes had already shown signs of collaboration with Persia. Many Thebans wanted to Mediz, accept Persian authority in exchange for survival. Leonidas kept the Theban troops at the pass essentially as hostages, preventing them from joining the enemy and providing proof that at least some Thebans had resisted. The force remaining to make the last stand now numbered roughly 1,400 men. 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans. Against them, Xerxes could deploy perhaps 100,000 troops, though only a fraction could engage simultaneously. The odds had gone from impossible to mathematically absurd. The Spartans repositioned slightly, moving forward from the wall to wider ground beyond it. This decision seemed counterintuitive. They were abandoning their fortification, but the logic was sound. Behind the wall, they could only kill Persians who climbed over it. In the wider area, they could engage more enemies simultaneously. Since death was certain regardless, maximizing the enemy casualty count became the only relevant objective. This was warfare stripped to its most basic calculation. The Spartans couldn't win or escape. They could only kill as many Persians as possible before being overwhelmed. Every Persian dead was one fewer marching on Athens. Every hour spent fighting was another hour for the Greek fleet at Artemisium to engage the Persian navy. The strategic value of this last stand was measured in time and blood, nothing more. The fighting intensified as the Spartans abandoned defensive tactics. Instead of waiting behind shields, they advanced into the Persian formations, using their superior armour and training to create maximum carnage before the inevitable end. The phalanx became a mobile killing machine, pushing forward, grinding through Persian troops, leaving a trail of bodies. Persian casualties accelerated dramatically. The narrow pass had limited how many Greeks could fight simultaneously, but also limited how many Persians could be killed per minute. In the wider area, the Spartans operated at full effectiveness. Their bronze armour deflected Persian weapons. Their training allowed them to fight in loose formation when necessary, then reform into phalanx instantly when threatened. Spears broke constantly in this intensity of combat. Wooden shafts splintered against shields, armour, bone. When a Spartan's dory broke, he dropped it without hesitation and drew his xiphos. The short sword was more effective at close range anyway, designed for exactly this kind of butchery. Stab under the armpit where armour gaps, thrust through the throat above the collar, punch the blade into the groin where arteries ran close to the surface. The killing was mechanical, emotionless, efficient. Every Spartan had trained for this since age 7. The movements were so deeply ingrained they happened without conscious thought. Block with shield, step forward, stab with sword, step back, repeat. The pattern continued until weapons broke or arms became too exhausted to lift. When xiphos blades snapped, and they did snap, bronze has limitations as sword material. Spartans grabbed whatever was available. Persian spears worked adequately. Rocks could crush skulls through helmets. Some fought with broken spear shafts, using the splintered wood like clubs. A few used their shields as weapons, the heavy bronze rim capable of breaking bones on impact. Leonidas fought in the front ranks, which was both militarily foolish and psychologically essential. A king who commanded from safety wouldn't inspire the same desperate courage. Leonidas needed his men fighting beyond their limits, past the point where rational self-preservation should make them break and run. The only way to achieve that was demonstrating he was dying alongside them, not watching from behind. The Persian commanders recognized Leonidas by his armour and position. Greek kings wore distinctive equipment, and Spartans in the front rank inevitably clustered around their leader. Multiple attempts were made to kill him specifically, not just to eliminate an enemy commander, but to break Spartan morale by removing the symbol they rallied around. Leonidas fell around midday of the third day. Accounts disagree on the exact cause. Some say arrows, others claim Persian spears in close combat. A few suggest he was simply overwhelmed by sheer numbers pressing against him. The mechanism mattered less than the result. The Spartan king was down, possibly still alive, certainly incapacitated. What happened next demonstrated the depth of Spartan military culture. The warriors nearest Leonidas immediately formed a protective circle around his body, shields outward, fighting with suicidal intensity to prevent the Persians from taking the corpse. In Greek warfare, recovering your dead was sacred duty. Allowing an enemy to desecrate a fallen king's body was unthinkable disgrace. The Persians recognized the significance of Leonidas's fall and pushed hard to capture the body. If they could parade a Spartan king's corpse before the remaining Greeks, morale might collapse completely. Both sides poured troops into an incredibly small space, creating a killing ground measured in yards where hundreds died fighting over one man's corpse. The struggle for Leonidas's body lasted perhaps 30 minutes, an eternity in combat terms. The Spartans held, though it cost them dozens of warriors. They pulled the king's body back to a small hill at the eastern end of the pass, the last defensible position available. The Persians surged forward, sensing victory, only to hit reformed phalanx that held firm despite catastrophic casualties. By early afternoon, the surviving Greeks, now perhaps 800 total, maybe half of them Spartans, held a shrinking perimeter on the hill. They had abandoned all equipment except weapons and whatever armour remained intact. Shields were battered, dented, sometimes held together by sheer desperation. Swords were dulled or broken. The only things still functioning perfectly were the men themselves, still fighting, still killing, still holding. The immortals descended from the mountain path behind them, completing the encirclement. The Greeks were now surrounded by Persian forces on all sides, fighting a three-dimensional battle against enemies who could attack from any direction. The phalanx, designed for frontal combat, became impossible to maintain. The formation dissolved into individual combats, small groups fighting back to back, keeping each other alive through mutual protection. The Persians tightened the circle slowly, cautiously. They had learned over 3 days that rushing Spartans was expensive. Better to compress the perimeter gradually, using arrows and javelins to kill from range, only closing for hand-to-hand combat when necessary. The Greeks had no answer for this tactic. They couldn't charge through thousands of enemies. They couldn't hold a formation that was being compressed from all sides. Weapons became useless as they broke or were dropped by men too exhausted to hold them. Some Spartans fought with their hands, grabbing Persian spears and yanking the wielders forward into knife range. Others used their helmets as improvised clubs after losing everything else. The Thebans, seeing the end approaching and having less investment in dying gloriously, surrendered en masse. The Persians accepted their surrender and immediately branded them as slaves, marking them permanently as cowards who begged for life. The final Spartans and Thespians were buried under a literal avalanche of Persian troops, not killed in combat so much as smothered under the weight of hundreds of bodies pressing inward from all sides. The last Greeks died unable to swing weapons or even move their arms, simply crushed by mass. When it ended, the pass was silent except for the moaning of wounded and the sound of carrion birds gathering overhead. The Persians had won the ground but paid a price that shocked even their own commanders. Perhaps 20,000 Persian casualties across 3 days, dead, wounded or too traumatized to fight, in exchange for killing 1,400 Greeks. Xerxes walked through the carnage personally, examining the battlefield with an expression witnesses described as disturbed. This wasn't how empire worked. Victories were supposed to be overwhelming, decisive, relatively cheap. Instead, he had spent 3 days and thousands of troops taking a pass he should have captured in hours. The psychological impact on his army was visible. Soldiers looked at the Greek corpses with something approaching respect, even fear. Then Xerxes made a decision that revealed how deeply these 3 days had affected him. He ordered Leonidas's body found among the dead, identified, decapitated, and the corpse crucified on display. This was unprecedented treatment for a fallen enemy commander. Kings received honourable burial, even from their enemies. Desecrating Leonidas's corpse was an act of personal rage, not military strategy. The order exposed weakness disguised as strength. Xerxes needed to humiliate the Spartans because they had humiliated him. 300 men had held his entire army for 3 days. That fact would spread throughout his empire faster than any official dispatch. The brutal treatment of Leonidas's body was meant to reclaim dominance, to prove that Persian power was still absolute. But crucifying a dead king doesn't erase 3 days of tactical failure. Every soldier in the Persian army knew what they had witnessed. They had seen a handful of Greeks kill thousands of Persians without breaking or retreating. They had learned that Greek hoplites in good terrain were essentially unstoppable regardless of numbers. That knowledge would infect every future battle, making Persian troops hesitant when facing Greek heavy infantry. The pass was open. The road to Athens lay undefended. Xerxes had won. But the victory tasted like ashes, and something had changed that couldn't be reversed by winning battles. The Phocian troops who abandoned the Anopeia path reached friendly territory by evening of the 3rd day, bringing detailed reports of how quickly the position had collapsed. Their commander justified the retreat as tactical necessity. Staying would have meant annihilation without delaying the Persians significantly. The explanation was rational, militarily sound, and completely missed the point of what Thermopylae had become. Leonidas had never expected the mountain path to hold indefinitely. He understood human nature well enough to know that troops defending a secondary position, away from the main battle, would rationalize retreat when faced with overwhelming force. The Phocians weren't Spartans. They hadn't spent their entire lives preparing for suicidal last stands. Expecting them to die to the last man defending a mountain trail was unrealistic. But the speed of their collapse had been catastrophic. The Phocians hadn't even fought. They had formed up, seen the immortals approaching, and scattered. Not a single Persian casualty, not even a brief skirmish to slow the advance. The path that should have taken hours for the Persians to force had been abandoned in minutes. Ephialtes disappeared after guiding the immortals to the path. He collected his payment, likely a substantial sum in Persian gold, and vanished into the chaos of war-torn Greece. His name became synonymous with betrayal in Greek culture, used for centuries afterward as shorthand for traitor. Later accounts claim he was eventually hunted down and killed by Spartans years after the battle, though this might be legend rather than history. The tactical betrayal mattered less than its timing. If the Phocians had held even for 2 hours, the allied Greek contingents at Thermopylae could have withdrawn in organised fashion, maintaining unit cohesion and fighting capability. Instead, the news of encirclement arrived while fighting was underway, forcing immediate evacuation under combat conditions. Units scattered, some heading south toward Athens, others toward the Peloponnese, a few attempting to reach the coast and escape by sea. The Persian cavalry, freed from the constraints of the narrow pass, hunted these retreating Greeks mercilessly. Horsemen ranged across the countryside, cutting down stragglers and isolated groups. The hunt wasn't particularly effective. Most Greeks escaped, but it added casualties to a force that had already been bleeding for 3 days. Perhaps 200 Greeks died during the retreat, killed by cavalry or exhaustion. The simultaneous naval battle at Artemisium had been raging for 3 days, matching the timeline of Thermopylae. The Greek fleet, approximately 280 triremes commanded by Athenian Admiral Themistocles, faced a Persian fleet of perhaps 600 to 800 ships. The numbers were less lopsided than they appeared. Greek triremes were superior vessels with better trained crews, designed specifically for ramming tactics in confined waters. The first day of naval combat had been indecisive. both fleets testing each other without committing to major engagement. The second day brought a storm that devastated the Persian fleet, sinking or damaging dozens of ships caught in open water. The Greeks, positioned closer to shore with better knowledge of local weather patterns, suffered minimal losses. This was the kind of tactical advantage that multiplied effectiveness far beyond raw numbers. The third day saw serious combat as the Persians tried to force a decisive victory before their fleet deteriorated further. Multiple engagements throughout the day resulted in roughly even casualties. Both sides lost ships, both claimed victory, both retreated to their respective bases for repairs. The tactical draw meant strategic Greek success, since every Persian ship lost was irreplaceable, while Greek losses could potentially be rebuilt. News of Thermopylae's fall reached the Greek fleet late on the third day. Themistocles faced an immediate decision: continue fighting a battle that was at best stalemated, or retreat before the Persian army advancing from the north cut off escape routes. The answer was obvious. The fleet withdrew south during the night, abandoning Artemisium and conceding northern Greece to Persian control. The strategic situation now looked catastrophic for Greece. Northern Greece had fallen. The pass at Thermopylae was lost. The fleet at Artemisium had retreated. Nothing stood between the Persian army and Athens except open countryside and small cities that couldn't possibly resist. Xerxes had clear roads all the way to the Peloponnese if he wanted them. Athens began complete evacuation the moment news arrived of Thermopylae's fall. This wasn't panic. It was planned emergency response. The Athenians had been preparing for this possibility since learning the Persian invasion was coming. Every family had designated evacuation routes and destinations. Most went to the nearby island of Salamis, a short boat ride across the straits. Others fled to Troezen, a city in the Peloponnese that had agreed to shelter refugees. The evacuation took 3 days of continuous effort. Perhaps 200,000 people, the entire population of Athens and the surrounding countryside, moved to safety, taking whatever possessions they could carry. The city that had defeated Persia at Marathon 10 years earlier now stood empty, abandoned to its fate. The Acropolis, Athens' fortified hilltop sanctuary, was left defended by a small garrison of priests and the most elderly citizens who refused to leave. Xerxes arrived at abandoned Athens roughly 3 weeks after breaking through Thermopylae. His army had moved deliberately, accepting surrenders from cities along the route, establishing supply depots, securing their lines of communication. The slow advance was strategic. Rushing deep into enemy territory without secure logistics was how armies starved and disintegrated. The Persian king stood before the empty city and faced a problem he hadn't anticipated. Military victory was clear. Athens couldn't resist. Its population had fled. Its defences were minimal. But political victory was impossible. You can't force a surrender from people who aren't there. You can't impose terms on a government that is evacuated. Athens existed as a population, not a place, and that population was safely beyond Persian reach. The response was predictable and devastating. Persian troops burned Athens systematically, starting with the wooden buildings and moving to more substantial structures. The fire raged for days, consuming temples, homes, markets, everything flammable. The Acropolis held out briefly, its small garrison resisting until the Persians discovered a hidden path up the back of the hill. Everyone inside was killed, the temples looted and burned. The destruction was meant to send a message: this is the price of resistance. But the message required an audience, and the Athenians were safely across the water on Salamis, watching their city burn. The psychological impact was complex: horror at seeing everything familiar destroyed, but also grim satisfaction that the city's population had been saved. Buildings could be rebuilt. Dead citizens couldn't. The burning of Athens created unexpected diplomatic opportunities for the Greeks. Many cities that had been considering surrender now hesitated. If this was how Persia treated major cities that resisted, what hope did smaller communities have of fair treatment? The spectacle of Athens in flames was meant to terrify Greece into submission, but instead stiffened resolve in cities that understood they might be next. The Greek fleet had repositioned at Salamis, the narrow straits between the island and the mainland. Themistocles argued passionately for making a stand here rather than retreating further south. The geography favoured Greek tactics, narrow waters where Persian numbers meant nothing, and Greek ramming skills could dominate. The other Greek commanders were divided, many wanting to fall back to the Isthmus of Corinth and defend the Peloponnese. The debate revealed the fundamental fragmentation that had plagued Greek resistance from the beginning. Each city prioritized its own survival over collective strategy. The Peloponnesian cities wanted to retreat to the isthmus because that protected their territory. Athens had nothing left to protect except its refugee population on Salamis. The conflicting interests threatened to shatter Greek unity at the exact moment coordination was most critical. Themistocles reportedly broke the deadlock through a trick that modern historians debate. He supposedly sent a secret message to Xerxes claiming he wanted to betray the Greek fleet, informing the Persian king that the Greeks were planning to scatter and escape during the night. This intelligence prompted Xerxes to block the exits from Salamis immediately, trapping the Greek fleet in the straits. Whether the message was real or invented later to make Themistocles look clever, the result was undeniable. The Persian fleet moved to surround and trap the Greeks in narrow waters where the Greek advantages in ship design and crew skill would be maximized. Xerxes had essentially chosen the battlefield that favored his enemy, thinking he was preventing their escape. The Battle of Salamis began at dawn with the Persian fleet entering the straits in dense formation, hundreds of ships attempting to maneuver in confined space. The Greeks attacked in coordinated waves, using their triremes like battering rams, striking Persian vessels at the waterline and sinking them with single impacts. The Persian ships, lighter and less robust, splintered under these attacks. The confined space became a disaster for the Persians. Ships couldn't maneuver without colliding with each other. Sinking vessels blocked pathways, creating obstacles that made formation impossible. Greek crews, rowing in disciplined coordination, could position their ships precisely for optimal ramming angles. Persian crews, many pressed into service from conquered territories with minimal training, struggled to respond. The battle raged through morning into afternoon. Xerxes watched from a golden throne positioned on a hill overlooking the straits, witnessing his fleet's destruction in real time. Estimates suggest the Persians lost 200 or more ships, perhaps a third of their remaining fleet. The Greeks lost perhaps 40 ships, a sustainable casualty rate given their numerical inferiority. The naval defeat changed everything strategically. Xerxes suddenly faced the possibility of being trapped in Greece without secure supply lines. His army needed constant food, equipment, reinforcements, all shipped from Asia across the Hellespont. If the Greek fleet could contest those supply routes, the entire invasion could collapse not through military defeat, but through logistical starvation. The great king made a decision that shocked his commanders. He would return to Persia with a substantial portion of the army, leaving his general Mardonius with approximately 100,000 troops to complete the conquest. The official explanation was that the king needed to attend to other parts of his empire. The real reason was fear that the Greeks might destroy his bridges across the Hellespont and trap him on the European side. This decision was militarily sensible but psychologically devastating. Xerxes had invaded with the largest army in human history, conquered most of Greece, burned Athens, and achieved every objective except final victory. Yet he was retreating, pulling back to safety, demonstrating that the Greeks had hurt him badly enough to make him reconsider whether conquest was worth the cost. Mardonius, left with the task of finishing what Xerxes started, spent the winter in northern Greece, rebuilding his forces and planning spring campaigns. He understood the strategic situation clearly. He commanded a force large enough to defeat any individual Greek city, but not large enough to conquer all of Greece simultaneously. Success required keeping the Greek cities divided, preventing them from uniting into a coordinated defense. The winter months saw frantic diplomatic activity as both sides attempted to gain allies or neutralize enemies. Mardonius offered generous terms to Athens: restoration of their city, autonomy within the Persian Empire, substantial gold payments. The Athenians refused, which was predictable given they'd just watched their city burn. But the fact that Persia was negotiating at all signalled weakness that other Greek cities noticed. The Spartans faced intense pressure to commit their full army to defending Greece. They had sent only 300 warriors to Thermopylae, using religious festivals as excuse for limited deployment. Now, with Persia still occupying most of Greece and threatening to permanently conquer everything north of the Peloponnese, excuses were wearing thin. The other Greek cities demanded that Sparta act like the military leader it claimed to be. Athens played this diplomatic game ruthlessly. Athenian envoys informed Sparta that if no major military support arrived, Athens would be forced to accept Persian terms and join the empire. This was probably a bluff. Athens had already rejected better offers, but Sparta couldn't risk it, and Athens allied with Persia would give the invaders the strongest navy in Greece, making the Peloponnese indefensible. The pressure worked. Sparta committed to fielding its entire army, 5,000 Spartiates plus 35,000 Helots, serving as light infantry for a decisive battle. Other Peloponnesian cities contributed additional troops, building a combined force of perhaps 40,000 heavy infantry plus supports. This was the largest Greek army ever assembled, representing genuine unity that had been impossible to achieve before Thermopylae. The two armies converged on Plataea, a plain in Boeotia roughly 50 miles northwest of Athens. The terrain was relatively open compared to Thermopylae, allowing for large-scale manoeuvring and cavalry operations. Mardonius positioned his forces with the Persians in the centre, still the most disciplined and effective troops in his army, flanked by allied Greeks who had Medised and various contingent forces from across the empire. The battle developed over several days of skirmishing and positional manoeuvring. Neither side wanted to attack across open ground against prepared defences. Mardonius had learned at Thermopylae that frontal assaults against Greek heavy infantry were expensive. The Greeks understood that Persian cavalry and archers could devastate formations caught in the open. The decisive moment came when the Greek centre appeared to break and retreat. Persian forces, seeing the opportunity, charged forward in pursuit. The retreat was staged, a tactical lure to draw the Persians away from their fortified positions and into range of the full Greek phalanx. When the Greeks turned and formed battle line, the Persians were caught in the open, committed to engagement they hadn't intended. The resulting combat was everything Thermopylae had promised, but on massive scale. The Greek phalanx crashed into Persian formations with coordinated precision, spears stabbing, shields pushing, bronze armour deflecting the lighter Persian weapons. The Spartans led the charge, fighting with intensity that witnesses described as superhuman. Every warrior there understood they were avenging the 300. Mardonius died in the fighting, struck down in close combat while trying to rally his troops. His death broke the Persian command structure, creating confusion that rippled through their entire army. Units that had been holding firm suddenly found themselves leaderless, unsure whether to advance, hold, or retreat. The Greeks pressed their advantage ruthlessly, driving forward through gaps in the Persian line. The Persian camp fell by afternoon, overrun by Greeks who found vast stores of supplies and treasure that Mardonius had been accumulating. The Persian army disintegrated into retreat that became rout, streaming north toward friendly territory with Greeks pursuing and killing stragglers. Estimates suggest 50,000 or more Persian casualties, possibly higher. Greek losses were severe but sustainable, perhaps 10,000 dead. The victory at Plataea, coming almost exactly 1 year after Thermopylae, effectively ended the Persian invasion. The survivors retreated across the Hellespont back to Asia, abandoning all territorial gains in Europe. Greece remained independent, though scarred by war and occupation. Athens began rebuilding immediately, using timber from Persian wrecks to reconstruct their fleet. The strategic arc from Thermopylae to Plataea revealed something essential about how military victories actually work. Leonidas hadn't stopped the Persian invasion. He had delayed it for 3 days. Those 3 days hadn't been militarily decisive. The Persians had broken through and conquered Athens afterward. But psychologically, those 3 days had accomplished something no conventional victory could match. 300 Spartans had demonstrated that the Persian Empire could be resisted, that numerical superiority didn't guarantee victory, that Greek heavy infantry could defeat anything Xerxes fielded. This psychological shift transformed Greek military confidence from cautious hope to genuine belief in victory. When the united Greek army marched to Plataea, every soldier remembered Thermopylae and fought like he was one of the 300. The transformation was visible in casualty ratios. At Marathon, Greeks killed roughly 30 Persians for each Greek death. At Thermopylae, the ratio approached 200 to 1 in the narrow pass. At Plataea, fighting in open terrain that favoured Persian tactics, Greeks still maintained roughly 5 to 1 casualty ratios. The mathematical progression showed armies learning, adapting, becoming more effective through both experience and belief. Xerxes never returned to Greece. He spent the rest of his reign dealing with rebellions elsewhere in his empire, each one emboldened by news that the great king had been stopped by a few thousand Greeks. The invasion that was supposed to demonstrate unlimited Persian power had instead shown clear limits. Egypt rebelled shortly after Plataea, requiring years to reconquer. Babylon attempted independence and was brutally suppressed. The empire survived but never again expanded into Europe. The 300 had died buying 3 days. Those 3 days had bought time for evacuations, fleet positioning and diplomatic coordination. That coordination had enabled Salamis, which prevented Persian naval superiority. Without naval superiority, Xerxes couldn't secure supply lines, forcing his retreat. His retreat enabled Plataea, which expelled Persia from Greece permanently. The causal chain was complex but traceable. Remove Thermopylae and the timeline collapses. Athens doesn't evacuate successfully. The fleet doesn't position at Salamis optimally. Greek unity fractures earlier. Leonidas understood this calculus when he selected his 300. The mission was never military victory. It was buying time measured in hours and days, purchased with lives spent as strategically as possible. The question became whether those 3 days were worth 400 lives, whether the sacrifice had been necessary or just theatrical. Greek philosophers would debate this for centuries, questioning whether the same outcome might have been achieved through retreat and regrouping rather than suicidal last stands. The answer depended on understanding something beyond military tactics, how human psychology responds to sacrifice. The dawn of the final day broke differently than the previous 2. No careful preparation. No time for ritual grooming or equipment checks. The Greeks who remained at Thermopylae, roughly 400 men, knew encirclement was complete. Persian forces approached from both directions, north and south, the jaws of the trap closing with mathematical certainty. Leonidas gathered his commanders for final orders that were more farewell than strategy. The Spartans would hold the centre. The Thespians would fight on the right flank. The Thebans, still suspect despite staying, took the left under close watch. No one discussed retreat because no retreat existed. The mountain path was lost. The coastal route was blocked. The sea offered no escape. No ships waited to evacuate defenders. The decision to move forward from the wall confused the Persian commanders watching from the hills. Standard defensive doctrine said hold your fortification, make enemies climb to you, maximize your advantages. Abandoning the wall seemed like panic or incompetence. Only when the Greek phalanx formed in the wider area beyond the wall did the tactical logic become clear. Behind the wall, the Greeks could only kill Persians fast enough to climb over stone. In open ground, they could engage on broader front, bring more spears to bear simultaneously, create maximum casualties before being overwhelmed. Since survival was impossible, efficiency of killing became the only metric that mattered. More dead Persians meant more fear in Persian ranks, more hesitation in future battles, more chance that other Greeks would find courage to resist. The Spartans advanced first, moving as a unit despite the chaos of their situation. The phalanx formation held perfect, shields aligned, spears level, advancing at walking pace that seemed almost casual. This wasn't bravado. It was decades of drilling creating automatic behavior that persisted, even when rational thought said nothing mattered anymore. Persian troops directly ahead of the Spartan advance actually retreated without engaging. They had spent 2 days learning that fighting these bronze-armoured demons cost blood by the gallon. Watching 300 of them advance in perfect formation, knowing they were trapped and fighting with nothing to lose, created hesitation that spread through the Persian front ranks like disease. The first contact came when the Spartans reached a point where retreat was no longer possible. Persians behind would attack their backs if they tried withdrawing. The Greeks simply stopped advancing and started killing. Spears thrust mechanically, finding gaps in armour, throats, faces, anywhere vulnerable. The front Persian ranks tried to fall back and found their own troops preventing retreat. The resulting crush killed Persians more efficiently than Greek weapons could manage. Men suffocated standing upright, pressed too tightly to breathe. Others tripped over bodies and were trampled by their own comrades trying to retreat from the Greek spears. The Spartans exploited this chaos ruthlessly, pushing forward into the compressing mass, stabbing downward at fallen enemies, maintaining formation even as bodies piled knee-high. Leonidas fought perhaps 20 yards ahead of where tactical doctrine said a commander should position himself. He wasn't seeking death deliberately. Spartans considered suicide cowardice, but he was fighting with the absolute front rank rather than directing from behind. Every warrior nearby understood what this meant. Their king was showing them how to die properly by example in detail, one Persian corpse at a time. The Thespians matched Spartan intensity despite lacking comparable training. These were citizen soldiers, farmers and craftsmen who drilled perhaps a few weeks per year, yet they held their position with determination that approached Spartan standards. They understood the mathematics as clearly as anyone. Their families needed time to evacuate Thermopylae, and every hour bought here was another hour for children to reach safety. The Theban contingent fought with less enthusiasm, though still effectively. Many Thebans privately supported Persian conquest, believing survival under foreign rule beat destruction through resistance. But Leonidas had kept them at the pass essentially as hostages, and now pride wouldn't allow retreat while Spartans and Thespians died around them. They fought competently if not suicidally, killing Persians while looking for opportunities to surrender that wouldn't appear dishonourable. The Persian response evolved as morning progressed. Initial frontal assaults failed as they had for 2 days, producing casualty ratios that would bankrupt any army if sustained. Persian commanders switched to missile tactics, pulling back infantry and ordering archers forward to shoot volleys into the Greek formations from safe distance. Thousands of arrows arced into the sky, darkening the sun as the saying goes, though the actual visual effect was less dramatic than legend suggests. Most arrows struck shields or armor and deflected harmlessly. Some found gaps, an exposed neck, an arm raised to stab, a face turned wrong direction, and inflicted wounds that accumulated slowly. A man could fight with an arrow through his thigh if pain hadn't made him collapse yet. 2 arrows were harder. 3 became impossible. The Greeks had no effective counter to massed archery except endurance. They couldn't charge the archers without breaking formation, which would let Persian infantry attack their flanks. They couldn't retreat because the immortals now blocked that direction completely. They could only stand in formation and absorb arrows until casualty rates broke their line. Spartan training had included scenarios for fighting under sustained missile fire. The drill was simple: close ranks around wounded, maintain shield wall, trust your armor. Greek bronze was thick enough to stop most arrows at anything beyond point-blank range. The shield, properly angled, could deflect shots that would otherwise hit vulnerable areas. The Corinthian helmet, for all its limitations on vision and hearing, protected the head completely. But no armor covered everything. Arrows hit the exposed rear of thighs where greaves ended. They struck forearms between wrist and elbow, where armor pieces met with only leather protection. They found the gap at the shoulder where the breastplate connected to the back plate. Each hit degraded fighting capability incrementally. A wounded arm couldn't hold a spear steady. An injured leg made maintaining formation harder. Blood loss created exhaustion faster than combat did. Leonidas took an arrow through the shoulder, punching through the gap in his armor. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was crippling, making his right arm partially useless. He switched his spear to his left hand, less skilled but functional, and continued fighting. Warriors nearby moved slightly closer, narrowing gaps, providing additional protection for their wounded king. The Persian archers maintained their volleys for hours, launching thousands of arrows into an area roughly the size of a basketball court. The Greeks became pincushions, bristling with shafts like porcupines while still fighting. Men collapsed from blood loss, exhaustion, shock. The formation contracted as casualties mounted. Wounded warriors pulled back to center, while healthy fighters took their positions on the perimeter. Around midday, the arrows stopped. Not because the Persians ran out, but because the Greek formation was small enough now that massed infantry could engage effectively. The immortals moved forward again, joined by regular Persian troops, converging from multiple directions. The Greeks formed a rough circle, shields outward, spears ready, about 600 men still able to fight from the original 1,400. The final phase of combat was grinding attrition without tactical complexity. Persians attacked from all sides, the Greeks killed everyone who came within spear range, and slowly the circle contracted as defenders died. No dramatic charges, no inspiring speeches, just repetitive motion, block, thrust, kill, repeat, until arms refused to lift or legs refused to stand. Leonidas fell during this phase, though accounts differ on specifics. Some sources claim arrows finally brought him down after he'd taken multiple hits. Others suggest he was killed in close combat by Persian infantry, who recognized his armor and targeted him specifically. A few claim he was deliberately struck by fellow Spartans who had orders to preserve his body, though this seems unlikely given Spartan military culture. The moment Leonidas went down, the warriors nearest him abandoned all offensive action to defend his corpse. This wasn't emotional response, it was doctrine drilled into every Spartan from youth. Recovering your dead, especially fallen leaders, was sacred duty that took absolute priority over tactical advantage or personal survival. Letting enemies desecrate a king's body brought shame worse than death. The Persians recognized what the Greeks were protecting and pushed hard to capture the body. Taking Leonidas's corpse would allow them to parade it before the other Greek forces, proving their king was dead and destroying morale. Both sides poured troops into this incredibly condensed space, creating casualty density that exceeded anything from the previous 2 days. The struggle lasted perhaps 20 minutes of continuous combat, where individual fights blurred into collective murder. Greeks formed overlapping shields around Leonidas's body, creating a protective dome of bronze. Persians tried to break through by sheer weight, climbing over their own wounded to reach the defenders. The space became so constricted that weapons were useless. Men fought with fists, teeth, helmets used as clubs, anything available. The Greeks held. They pulled Leonidas's body back toward a small hillock at the eastern end of the pass, the last defensible terrain available. Perhaps 300 warriors remained combat effective at this point, mostly Spartans and Thespians. The Thebans had begun surrendering in small groups, laying down weapons and accepting captivity rather than pointless death. The Persian response to Theban surrender revealed how much these 3 days had affected enemy psychology. Instead of accepting surrender graciously as Romans might later do, the Persians branded captured Thebans immediately as slaves, marking them permanently with hot iron as punishment for resistance. This harsh treatment was unusual for Persian military practice, which typically rewarded surrender with mercy. The cruelty was personal, driven by rage over casualties suffered. The final Greek position on the hillock measured perhaps 50 yards across at its widest point. The survivors formed a tight circle, shields touching, no gaps, wounded men in the centre protected by those still capable of fighting. They had abandoned everything non-essential, spare armour pieces, provisions, even most shields, as these became too damaged to function. Some fought with broken spears, others with swords, a few with rocks grabbed from the ground. The Persians surrounded this position completely, thousands of troops forming concentric rings around the shrinking Greek perimeter. But nobody wanted to be the next wave to assault. Everyone had seen what happened when you attacked Spartans in formation. The troops at the front held back, waiting for orders they hoped wouldn't come. Persian commanders tried multiple tactics to break the stalemate without more casualties. They offered surrender terms, lay down your weapons and you'll be treated honourably. The Greeks ignored this completely. Whether they didn't hear over the helmet's acoustic limitation or simply didn't care is unclear. Probably both. At this point, surrender wasn't physically possible even if desired. The Greeks were too wounded, too exhausted, too committed. Javelin volleys came next, lighter missiles easier to throw in high arcs over the Persian troops surrounding the hillock. These were moderately effective, wounding Greeks who no longer had shields to protect themselves. But the hillock slope meant many javelins skipped off the ground, or got caught in the mass of bodies already piled everywhere. The final assault came from all directions simultaneously. Thousands of Persians rushing the hillock in coordinated charge designed to overwhelm through pure mass. The Greeks killed the first wave almost entirely. Spears still functioned at point-blank range, and dying Spartans were still dangerous Spartans. The second wave stepped over corpses of the first and died similarly. The third wave reached the Greek line and engaged hand-to-hand. No phalanx anymore, just individual combats. Small groups fighting back-to-back, keeping each other alive through mutual protection. Spartans fought with training so deeply ingrained it functioned despite catastrophic injuries. Men with shattered legs stabbed from sitting positions. Warriors missing arms kicked enemies and head-butted with bronze helmets. Every technique learned in the agog was employed until physical capability failed. The Persians didn't break the defense, they buried it. Hundreds of Persian troops simply pressed inward from all sides, using body weight rather than weapons to overwhelm. The Greeks disappeared under the mass, still stabbing, still fighting, dying crushed rather than cut down. The last Spartans went down unable to move their arms because too many bodies pressed against them. When it ended, the silence was profound. No wounded Greeks remained. Persian troops had killed anyone still breathing to prevent further resistance. The hillock was invisible under Persian corpses and the occasional glimpse of bronze armour, showing where Greeks had made their final stand. Estimates suggest 4,000 Persian dead in the final assault alone, killed by perhaps 300 Greeks who were already wounded and exhausted. Xerxes walked the battlefield personally that afternoon, examining the carnage with expression witnesses described as disturbed rather than triumphant. The pass was his, the road to Athens clear, the tactical objective achieved. But the cost haunted him. 3 days to take a position he should have captured in hours. Perhaps 20,000 casualties total, dead, wounded, or too traumatized to fight effectively, exchanged for killing Tilly's 400 Greeks. The order to desecrate Leonidas's body came from genuine emotion rather than calculated strategy. Persian burial customs typically respected enemy dead, but Xerxes needed to reclaim psychological dominance after 3 days of humiliation. Leonidas's corpse was found among the dead, recognizable by armour and position, beheaded, and the body crucified on display where passing troops could see it. This treatment backfired spectacularly. In Greek culture, refusing proper burial to the dead was sacrilege that brought divine curse. Desecrating a king's body violated every code of honourable warfare. The news spread through Greece faster than any official report, transforming Leonidas from military commander into martyr, Thermopylae from defeat into sacred ground. The Persians cleared the pass over the next 2 days, moving bodies to sides, repairing damage to the road, establishing supply depots. The march south continued on schedule, though Persian troops moved with visible nervousness when passing the site. They had learned that Greek heavy infantry in defensive positions was essentially unstoppable, a lesson that would affect their psychology in every subsequent battle. The 300 were gone, but their impact was just beginning. Every Greek soldier who heard about Thermopylae understood something new. Persians could be beaten. Numerical superiority wasn't destiny. Standing and fighting could accomplish more than retreating and preserving strength. This psychological shift would prove more valuable than any tactical victory could have been. The immediate military situation remained dire. Persia controlled most of Greece. Athens would burn within weeks. Total conquest seemed inevitable. But something essential had changed that couldn't be measured in territory or casualties. The empire that thought itself invincible had been stopped for 3 days by 300 men. That fact was spreading through both armies, changing calculations about what was possible and what was worth risking everything to achieve. The Persian army reached Athens 3 weeks after Thermopylae, moving through countryside that offered no resistance. Small cities surrendered immediately, their gates opening before Persian scouts even requested it. The terror preceding the invasion had been theoretical, stories about massive armies and brutal conquests. Now it was tangible, visible in the dust clouds that preceded the army by miles, and the refugees fleeing south ahead of the advance. Athens stood empty when Xerxes arrived. Not abandoned in panic, but evacuated with methodical precision that indicated months of planning. Every household had removed valuables, every temple had been stripped of treasure, every military-age male had departed with the fleet. The Persians entered a ghost city populated only by stray dogs, and the elderly priests maintaining vigil at the Acropolis. The strategic implications infuriated Xerxes more than actual resistance would have. You can't negotiate with people who aren't present. You can't impose terms on a government that exists in exile. Military conquest requires someone to surrender, some authority to acknowledge defeat and accept terms. Athens had removed that possibility by transforming from a place into a population scattered across dozens of islands. The burning began immediately, not from military necessity but from rage. Persian troops torched the wooden structures first: homes, market stalls, administrative buildings. The fires spread quickly through the tightly packed residential districts, consuming entire neighborhoods in hours. Stone temples survived initially, but were systematically vandalized. Statues toppled, friezes smashed, anything beautiful deliberately destroyed. The Acropolis held out for 3 days, its small garrison utilizing the steep approach and narrow gates to create a miniature version of Thermopylae. Persian casualties were modest compared to the pass, maybe 200 dead, but any casualties taking an essentially empty religious site felt excessive. When Persian troops finally discovered the hidden path up the back of the hill, they killed everyone inside and burned the temples with particular thoroughness. From Salamis, the Athenian refugees watched their city burn. The orange glow was visible across the water, smoke columns rising for days. The psychological impact was calculated carefully by those who had planned the evacuation. Watching everything familiar destroyed created rage rather than despair. Anger focused outward at Persia rather than inward at their own leadership for abandoning the city. The Greek fleet at Salamis numbered roughly 380 triremes, with Athenian ships comprising about half that total. The remaining vessels came from Corinth, Aegina, Megara, and smaller cities that contributed what they could. This represented essentially the entire military naval capability of Greece concentrated in one location, which meant defeat here would be final. Themistocles dominated the strategic debates among Greek commanders despite not having supreme authority. His argument was simple: fight at Salamis or lose everything. The narrow straits negated Persian numerical superiority. Greek crews were better trained for ramming tactics, and geography prevented the Persian fleet from using its size effectively. Retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth meant fighting in open water where Persian numbers would dominate. The Peloponnesian commanders wanted exactly that retreat. Their cities were protected by the Isthmus regardless of what happened to Athens. Let the Athenians deal with Persian occupation. Sparta and Corinth would be safe behind their defensive wall. This calculation was brutally logical and strategically foolish, since Persian naval superiority would make the Isthmus wall irrelevant by enabling landings behind it. Themistocles broke the deadlock through methods that ancient sources describe vaguely, suggesting manipulation or outright deception. The most famous account claims he sent a secret message to Xerxes suggesting the Greek fleet was planning to escape during the night, prompting the Persians to block the exits from Salamis immediately. Whether this happened or was invented later to make Themistocles look brilliant remains historically uncertain. What's undeniable is that the Persian fleet moved to surround and trap the Greeks in the straits, positioning itself in confined waters where Greek advantages would be maximized. Xerxes had learned nothing from Thermopylae about how terrain affects combat effectiveness. He was repeating the exact mistake, bringing superior numbers into confined space where those numbers became liability rather than asset. The Battle of Salamis began at dawn with the Persian fleet entering the straits in dense formation. Hundreds of ships attempted to maneuver in waters that could barely accommodate 50 fighting simultaneously. The Persian advantage in numbers immediately became disadvantage as ships collided with each other, fouled oars, blocked passages. Greek triremes attacked in coordinated waves, using tactics perfected over decades of naval warfare. The rams, bronze-covered wooden beams projecting from the bow, were designed to strike enemy vessels at the waterline, punching holes that sank ships within minutes. Greek crews could position their triremes with precision, accelerate to ramming speed, strike, reverse oars to pull free, and wheel away before the target's crew could respond. The Persians had numbers and courage but lacked the coordinated training that made Greek naval tactics effective. Many Persian ships came from conquered territories, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks from Ionia, with crews that had minimal time training together. They knew how to row and fight individually, but couldn't execute the complex maneuvers that naval combat required. The confined space created cascading failures throughout the Persian fleet. A ship disabled by ramming blocked the path of vessels behind it. Those vessels, trying to maneuver around the obstacle, exposed their flanks to Greek rams. Sinking ships created debris fields that further restricted movement. Within hours, the straits were clogged with wreckage, drowning sailors, and damaged vessels limping toward shore. Xerxes watched from his golden throne positioned on Mount Aegaleo overlooking the straits. He had a clear view of the disaster unfolding below, his fleet being systematically destroyed by an enemy that should have been overwhelmed through numerical superiority alone. Scribes positioned nearby recorded the battle's progress, noting which Persian commanders distinguished themselves and which failed, though the lists were probably never completed given how comprehensively the battle was lost. The casualty estimates vary wildly depending on source, but conservative modern assessments suggest the Persians lost 200 ships or more, roughly a third of their remaining fleet. The Greeks lost perhaps 40 ships, a sustainable rate given their numerical inferiority. More importantly, Greek morale skyrocketed while Persian confidence shattered. The strategic implications became clear within days. Xerxes couldn't continue the invasion without secure naval supply lines. His army needed constant resupply, food, equipment, reinforcements, all shipped from Asia. With the Greek fleet intact and capable of contesting those routes, the entire invasion could collapse from logistical starvation rather than military defeat. The Great King made his decision quickly: retreat to Asia with most of the army, leave Mardonius with sufficient force to complete the conquest. The official explanation emphasized other imperial concerns requiring royal attention. The reality was transparent fear. Fear that Greeks would destroy the bridges across the Hellespont and trap him in Europe. Fear that continued losses would inspire rebellion elsewhere in the empire. Fear that remaining in Greece risked personal humiliation beyond what he'd already suffered. The retreat began within a week of Salamis. Roughly 100,000 Persian troops remained under Mardonius, tasked with finishing what Xerxes had started. The rest, perhaps 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers plus support personnel, began the long march back to Asia. The withdrawal was conducted efficiently, maintaining unit cohesion and supply chains, but the psychological impact was devastating. The largest invasion force in human history was retreating because a handful of Greeks had inflicted unsustainable damage. Mardonius spent the winter consolidating his position in northern Greece, rebuilding troop morale, replacing equipment damaged during the previous year's campaigns. He understood clearly that his task was impossible without Greek disunity. He couldn't conquer all of Greece simultaneously. He needed cities to surrender individually or switch sides, fragmenting Greek resistance into manageable pieces. The diplomatic offensive began immediately. Mardonius offered Athens extraordinarily generous terms: complete restoration of their city at Persian expense, autonomy within the empire, substantial gold payments, recognition as equals rather than subjects. The offer was genuine. Persia badly wanted Athens neutralized, and buying that neutrality was cheaper than conquering it militarily. Athens refused, though the vote was apparently closer than patriotic accounts admit. Some Athenian citizens legitimately believed that accepting Persian terms made more sense than continued resistance that might destroy their city permanently. The faction favouring resistance won by arguing that Persian promises were worthless. Look at how they treated cities that surrendered peacefully. Sparta faced intense pressure from every direction. They had sent 300 warriors to Thermopylae and claimed that religious obligations prevented larger deployment. Now, with Persia still occupying most of Greece and threatening permanent conquest, those excuses rang hollow. The other Greek cities demanded that Sparta commit its full military strength, or be regarded as effectively allied with Persia through inaction. The Athenian diplomatic strategy was brutal and effective. Envoys informed Sparta that if substantial military support didn't arrive immediately, Athens would have no choice but to accept Mardonius's terms and join the Persian Empire. This was probably a bluff. Athens had rejected better offers already, but Sparta couldn't risk calling it. And Athens allied with Persia would give the invaders the strongest navy in Greece, plus intimate knowledge of Greek tactics and politics. The threat worked. Sparta mobilized its entire adult male citizen body, 5,000 Spartiates, plus 35,000 helots equipped as light infantry. This was unprecedented. Sparta had never deployed its full military strength outside the Peloponnese, always keeping substantial forces home to guard against helot rebellion. The decision to commit everything revealed how seriously they took the threat. Other Greek cities contributed forces once Sparta committed. Corinth provided 5,000 hoplites. Megara sent 3,000. Smaller cities added contingents ranging from hundreds to dozens. The combined Greek army approaching 40,000 heavy infantry plus thousands of light troops was the largest Greek military force ever assembled, representing genuine unity that had been impossible to achieve before Thermopylae demonstrated what coordinated resistance could accomplish. The two armies converged on Plataea in Boeotia, roughly 50 miles northwest of Athens. Mardonius selected this location carefully. The terrain allowed his cavalry to operate effectively, while providing defensive positions his infantry could fortify. The plain was large enough for major maneuvers, unlike Thermopylae's confining pass, which should favour Persian tactical flexibility. The battle developed over more than a week of positioning, skirmishing, and psychological warfare. Neither commander wanted to attack across open ground against prepared defences. Mardonius had learned at Thermopylae that frontal assaults against Greek heavy infantry in good terrain were suicidal. The Greeks understood that Persian cavalry and archers could devastate phalanx formations caught in the open without nearby protection. The Greek position was strong but had vulnerabilities. Their water supply came from a spring that Persian cavalry could harass, forcing Greeks to fight for access or abandon the position. Mardonius ordered constant cavalry raids against Greek supply lines, trying to create shortages that would force an offensive or retreat. The strategy was working. Greek supplies dwindled, water became rationed, tempers frayed among commanders debating strategy. The Greek Council of War was fractious and nearly led to catastrophic mistakes. Some commanders wanted immediate offensive before supplies ran out. Others insisted on holding position until Persians attacked. The compromise was a planned nighttime withdrawal to better terrain with more secure water access. But the maneuver was poorly coordinated and units became separated in darkness. Mardonius saw Greek formations fragmenting and ordered immediate attack, thinking he was pursuing a disorganized retreat. This was the critical Persian mistake. What looked like disorganized withdrawal was actually repositioning that would put Greek forces in stronger defensive positions. By attacking while Greeks were in motion, Mardonius committed his troops to battle before determining whether the tactical situation actually favoured him. The Spartans, commanded by Pausanias, were caught in the open during the Persian assault, but managed to form phalanx before cavalry could hit their flanks. The resulting combat was Thermopylae repeated at massive scale. Greek heavy infantry in formation against Persian troops whose equipment and training weren't designed for this type of fighting. The Spartans advanced steadily, pushing through Persian lines, killing with mechanical efficiency that observers found terrifying. Mardonius fought personally at the front, trying to rally his troops and demonstrate leadership through example. This was both inspiring and tactically foolish. Losing the commander in battle creates chaos regardless of how brave his death might be. A spear or javelin, accounts differ, struck Mardonius in the head, killing him instantly. His death rippled through the Persian command structure immediately, creating confusion about who was in command and what the strategic objective was. The Persian centre, where Mardonius had positioned himself, collapsed first. Units that had been holding firm suddenly found themselves leaderless, receiving conflicting orders from multiple subordinate commanders who weren't sure of their authority. The Greeks pressed forward ruthlessly, exploiting gaps in the disintegrating Persian line, surrounding isolated units and destroying them piecemeal. The Persian fortified camp fell by afternoon, overrun by Greeks who found vast stores of supplies, treasure, and equipment that Mardonius had accumulated. The wealth was staggering: gold, silver, jewellery, art pieces looted from across Greece during the occupation. The discovery proved that Persia had planned for long-term occupation, rather than quick conquest and withdrawal, making their defeat more strategically significant. The Persian army disintegrated into retreat that became rout. Units fled north toward Thessaly and friendly territory, pursued by Greek cavalry and light infantry who killed stragglers and prevented formation of defensive positions. Casualty estimates are unreliable, but ancient sources claim 50,000 or more Persian dead. Modern historians suggest lower numbers but still catastrophic losses, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 killed, more captured or scattered. Greek casualties were severe but sustainable, perhaps 10,000 dead from the initial 40,000, concentrated heavily among units caught in the open during early fighting. The Spartans lost perhaps 100 men from their 5,000, a ratio that demonstrates how effective their tactics remained even in less favourable terrain than Thermopylae. The survivors of the Persian force retreated across the Hellespont back to Asia, abandoning all territorial gains in Greece and Thrace. The invasion that was supposed to conquer Europe had ended in comprehensive defeat, not through single catastrophic loss, but through accumulation of tactical failures that eroded Persian capabilities until continued resistance became impossible. The strategic arc from Thermopylae through Salamis to Plataea revealed how victories actually compound. Leonidas's stand hadn't stopped the invasion militarily. Persians had broken through and burned Athens afterward. But psychologically, Thermopylae had demonstrated that resistance was possible, that Persian numbers didn't guarantee victory, that well-trained Greeks in good terrain were effectively unbeatable. This psychological foundation enabled Salamis. Greek commanders knew their ships and tactics were superior if they could negate Persian numerical advantage through terrain. The confidence came partially from watching 300 Spartans hold a pass for 3 days against impossible odds. If that was achievable, naval victory in narrow straits seemed reasonable rather than desperate. Salamis enabled Plataea by forcing Persian withdrawal and limiting the force Mardonius could deploy. But more importantly, Salamis confirmed that the pattern from Thermopylae was replicable. Terrain and tactics could overcome numerical superiority. Greek unity could defeat Persian diversity. Resistance could succeed rather than just delay inevitable conquest. At Plataea, the unified Greek army fought with confidence born from 2 previous victories. Every soldier remembered Thermopylae and understood that 300 Spartans had bought the time needed for Athens to evacuate, fleets to position, and armies to mobilize. The debt was being repaid in Persian blood on the Boeotian plain. The memorial at Thermopylae was erected within months of Plataea. funded by contributions from cities across Greece that had participated in the resistance. The monument itself was modest: a stone lion representing Leonidas, a mound covering the Greek dead, an inscription that became more famous than the battle itself. The poet Simonides composed the epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." Those 22 words in Greek captured something essential about why 300 deaths mattered more than victories involving tens of thousands. The Spartans hadn't died fighting for survival or personal glory. They had died because their laws required it, because their society demanded sacrifice, because duty superseded life. This concept, death as civic obligation rather than tragedy, resonated through Greek culture in ways that shaped Western civilization's understanding of heroism, but the story that spread wasn't entirely accurate. Popular accounts inflated Persian numbers to absurd levels. Some claimed 2 million troops, others 5 million. The truth of perhaps 200,000 to 300,000 was still overwhelming, but not mathematically impossible. Exaggeration served psychological purposes, though, making the achievement seem even more spectacular and the lesson more applicable to future desperate situations. The tactical lessons from Thermopylae spread through Greek military culture immediately. Every commander understood now that terrain could multiply force effectiveness exponentially. Narrow passes, beach approaches, mountain paths, anywhere that negated numerical superiority became sought-after defensive positions. Greek city-states began surveying their territory specifically to identify locations where small forces could hold against large armies. The Spartans themselves became objects of fascination bordering on obsession. Other Greeks had always known Spartans were excellent warriors, but Thermopylae demonstrated capabilities that seemed superhuman. 300 men holding for 3 days against hundreds of thousands wasn't just impressive. It suggested fundamentally different psychology and training that other cities couldn't replicate even if they wanted to. This reputation paradoxically accelerated Sparta's long-term decline. The mystique of Spartan invincibility made them less willing to commit forces to battles where defeat was possible, fearing that losses would shatter the myth. Their rigid social system couldn't sustain casualties because the citizen body couldn't grow. New Spartans could only be born to existing Spartan families, and the Helot population required constant military presence to prevent rebellion. Within 50 years of Thermopylae, the Spartiate population had dropped to perhaps 3,000 adult males. Within a century, fewer than 1,000. The demographic collapse stemmed from multiple factors: casualties in constant warfare, declining birth rates among citizens, increasing inequality that pushed some families out of the citizen class. But the fundamental problem was that Sparta's social system was optimized for creating perfect warriors at the expense of everything else. Athens followed a different trajectory. The city rebuilt rapidly after Persian withdrawal, using timber from captured Persian ships to construct new buildings and expand the fleet. The reconstruction wasn't just physical. Athens experienced cultural flowering that produced Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the foundations of Western philosophy. The contrast with Sparta was stark. One society produced thinkers who changed human understanding of reality. The other produced nothing but increasingly scarce warriors. The irony was that Thermopylae's cultural impact vastly exceeded its military significance. Strategically, the battle delayed the Persian invasion by 3 days. Important, but hardly decisive. The actual defeat of Persia came at Salamis and Plataea through naval superiority and coordinated infantry action. Yet those larger, more strategically significant battles never captured imagination the way Thermopylae did. The reason was narrative structure. Salamis was complex naval maneuvering difficult to visualize. Plataea was large-scale infantry combat spread over days and miles. Both victories were important but lacked the crystalline simplicity of 300 men in a narrow pass, fighting to certain death, buying time measured in hours and blood. That story was graspable, emotionally powerful, and applicable to countless future situations where the weak faced the strong. Roman historians absorbed the Thermopylae narrative and adapted it to their own military culture. The concept of fighting to the death rather than retreating became central to Roman tactical doctrine. Legions were designed to hold position regardless of casualties, with replacements moving forward as front ranks were decimated. The psychological foundation for this approach came partially from Greek examples, like Thermopylae demonstrating that determined resistance could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Medieval European warfare was dominated by armoured cavalry rather than infantry phalanxes, but the Thermopylae legend remained influential. Knights were educated on classical history and understood the cultural significance of choosing death over dishonour. The chivalric code that governed medieval warfare, fight bravely, protect the weak, die rather than flee, owed intellectual debt to Greek examples of heroic sacrifice. The American Revolution produced explicit comparisons to Thermopylae when outgunned colonials faced the British Empire. Revolutionary leaders cited classical examples to argue that numerical inferiority didn't determine outcomes if the cause was just and fighters were committed. The comparison was somewhat forced. American forces usually retreated rather than fighting to annihilation, but the psychological value of invoking Thermopylae helped sustain morale during difficult periods. Modern military academies still teach Thermopylae, though the lessons have evolved. Contemporary analysis focuses less on glory and more on tactical realities. Terrain matters enormously. Combined arms operations can overcome positional advantages. Intelligence failures can doom even strong defensive positions. The mountain path betrayal is studied as example of how single intelligence breaches can collapse entire strategies. But the enduring fascination with Thermopylae has less to do with military tactics than human psychology. The battle represents something primal about facing impossible odds, with full knowledge that death is certain. Every person encounters situations where retreat is easier than resistance, where accommodation costs less than confrontation, where survival requires compromising principles. Thermopylae says some things are worth dying for even when dying accomplishes nothing tangible. This message is both inspiring and dangerous. Inspiring because it elevates courage and duty above survival and comfort. Dangerous because it can justify pointless sacrifice, encouraging people to die for causes that don't warrant the cost. The 300 died to buy 3 days. Were those 3 days worth 400 lives? The answer depends entirely on what happened afterward. If Athens had surrendered despite the time bought, if Salamis had been lost, if Plataea had gone to Persia, then Thermopylae would be remembered as tragic waste. Brave men dying pointlessly to delay inevitable conquest. But Athens evacuated successfully. Salamis was won decisively. Plataea expelled Persia permanently. The 3 days mattered because they enabled everything that followed. This causal relationship is what separates meaningful sacrifice from pointless death. Thermopylae worked because it was part of coordinated strategy with clear objectives and follow-through. The 300 didn't die randomly. They died buying specific amounts of time for specific purposes that were actually accomplished. Their deaths had instrumental value beyond symbolic importance. Yet even this instrumental analysis misses something about why Thermopylae resonates across 500 years. The story touches deeper psychological territory about human nature and choice. Every person alive faces versions of the Thermopylae dilemma, situations where the reasonable choice is retreat or submission, where resistance seems futile, where standing firm costs more than accommodation would. The 300 demonstrate that human beings can choose principles over survival, when circumstances require it. This isn't about whether such choices are always wise. Often they're not. It's about the bare fact that such choices are possible, that people can override self-preservation instincts for abstract values like honor, duty, or protecting others. Sparta's society was monstrous in many ways. The Helot slaves outnumbered citizens 7-1, living in permanent terror maintained through state-sponsored murder. The Agog training system tortured children in the name of creating warriors. The entire civilization was built on foundations of cruelty that make modern regimes look humane. Yet this same society produced men capable of choosing certain death to protect cities they didn't live in and people they'd never met. The paradox is irresolvable because it reflects reality's complexity. Evil societies can produce individual heroism. Brutal training can create genuine courage. Societies built on oppression can defend freedom for others while denying it to their own populations. Thermopylae doesn't resolve these contradictions, it embodies them. The Persians weren't the monsters that Greek propaganda portrayed. Their empire was sophisticated, relatively tolerant by ancient standards, multicultural in ways that seem modern. Cyrus the Great, grandfather of Xerxes, freed Jewish exiles and allowed them to return to Jerusalem, an act of tolerance unprecedented in that era. Persian governance allowed conquered peoples to maintain their languages, religions, and customs as long as they paid taxes and acknowledged imperial authority. Yet from the Greek perspective, Persian rule meant the end of political autonomy, the end of democracy in cities that practiced it, the end of independent decision-making about war, trade, and internal governance. To Greeks, political freedom was worth fighting for even if Persian rule might have been materially comfortable. Thermopylae was about defending a particular form of society, argumentative, independent, democratic in some cities, against a different form that was efficient, stable, and authoritarian. The question of whether Greek freedom was worth 1,400 lives at Thermopylae plus tens of thousands more at Salamis and Plataea has no objective answer. To Greeks at the time, obviously yes. To modern observers weighing lives against political systems, the calculation becomes more ambiguous. The democratic ideals that Athens represented would eventually influence political development for millennia, but that outcome wasn't predictable in 480 BC. What's measurable is that Greek resistance succeeded. Persia never conquered Greece. The city-states maintained independence for another century, until Macedon unified them through different means. That century produced cultural achievements, philosophy, drama, art, political theory, that shaped Western civilization fundamentally. Whether that outcome was worth the price paid at Thermopylae depends on how one values political autonomy versus human life. The legend itself has become separate from the historical event. Most people who reference Thermopylae know the basic story. 300 Spartans, impossible odds, fought to the death, without understanding the broader strategic context or the nature of Spartan society. The story has been simplified into pure narrative of courage against overwhelming force, stripped of complicating details about slavery, child abuse, and military strategy. This simplification isn't necessarily distortion. Legends serve different purposes than history. The historical Thermopylae was complex. Flawed people from a brutal society making strategic sacrifice that enabled larger victory through combination of factors, including luck, enemy mistakes, and follow-through by others. The legendary Thermopylae is simpler. Brave warriors choosing death over surrender, holding ground against impossible odds, inspiring others through example. Both versions are true in different ways. The historical version is more accurate but less applicable to most situations. The legendary version loses detail but gains universality. Anyone can identify with facing overwhelming odds and choosing to stand firm rather than retreat. The power of the legend comes from its emotional accessibility rather than its tactical specificity. Modern references to Thermopylae usually invoke the legend rather than the history. Politicians cite it when arguing for resistance against superior force. Military commanders reference it when inspiring troops facing difficult odds. Business leaders use it as metaphor for competing against larger companies. The battle has become shorthand for any situation where the weak confront the strong and refuse to surrender despite rational calculus suggesting accommodation. This metaphorical usage would probably confuse the actual Spartans at Thermopylae, who saw themselves as executing military orders rather than making philosophical statements about courage. They died because Spartan law required dying when ordered, not because they chose martyrdom to inspire future generations. The nobility we attribute to their deaths is largely projection. We need heroes who choose principle over survival, so we interpret their actions through that lens. Yet the projection doesn't invalidate the lesson. Regardless of why the 300 stayed, the fact remains that they held for 3 days against overwhelming force, demonstrating that determined resistance in good terrain can accomplish the seemingly impossible. That tactical reality has been verified in countless battles since. Small forces in strong positions routinely defeat larger forces when conditions favour defence. The numbers 300 have themselves become culturally significant, instantly recognisable as referencing Thermopylae even without context. Movies, books, video games, and political speeches all invoke 300 as shorthand for heroic resistance. This cultural penetration 2,500 years after the event suggests the story touches something fundamental about human psychology that transcends cultures and eras. Perhaps what makes Thermopylae eternal is that it provides a story for the inevitability of death. Every human faces mortality. Every person eventually confronts situations where no escape exists, where the outcome is determined, where all that remains is how one faces the end. The 300 Model 1 answer to that universal human challenge. Face it on your feet, fighting, making the enemy pay maximum cost for your death. This isn't the only answer to mortality. Religion offers others. Philosophy provides alternatives. Simple acceptance has its own dignity. But it's an answer that has resonated for millennia, because it transforms defeat into something resembling victory. You die, but you die well. You lose, but you make victory expensive for those who beat you. You can't control outcomes, but you control how you face them. The Spartans would probably find this philosophical interpretation ridiculous. They were warriors executing orders in a society that valued obedience over independence. But what they intended matters less than what their actions demonstrated. That human beings can face certain death with discipline and courage, that sacrifice can have instrumental value beyond symbolic gesture, that sometimes standing firm against impossible odds is exactly the right choice even when rational analysis says otherwise. Thermopylae endures because it tells a story every generation needs to hear. You're not powerless even when overpowered. Your choices matter even when outcomes are determined. How you face the end defines its meaning. These lessons aren't always applicable. Sometimes retreat is wiser than resistance. Sometimes accommodation beats confrontation. Sometimes survival should trump principle. But sometimes, rarely, you reach the moment where all that matters is standing firm despite knowing you'll fall, where the only question remaining is whether you'll die on your feet or your knees, where 3 days bought at the cost of everything is worth more than decades of comfortable submission. The 300 Spartans faced that moment at Thermopylae. Their answer echoes still.